Some lives move gently through the world, touching little and leaving little behind. But some arrive with a quiet brilliance that seems almost impossible for their own century to contain. Tonight, I want to tell you about a man who lived 500 years ago, yet imagined machines that would not exist until long after his bones had turned to dust. A man who studied the curl of a river's current as if it were a line of poetry, who watched birds not for beauty alone, but to understand the geometry of flight, who believed that everything, from the muscles of a hand to the movement of planets, was connected by patterns waiting to be seen. Before we begin, if gentle, reflective stories like this bring you calm, feel free to subscribe and leave a like. It helps these quiet histories reach the people who need them. This is the soft story of Leonardo da Vinci, an artist, an inventor, a dreamer who could see the future long before the future could see him. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let the night open around you. Leonardo's childhood unfolded in the gentle cradle of the Tuscan countryside, a landscape where rolling hills softened into one another like layers of folded cloth, and the mornings arrived with a pale gold light that seemed to hum quietly across the fields. In the small village of Vinci, life moved at a pace that left room for noticing things. How the mist gathered in the valleys and lifted slowly as the sun warmed the earth. How the narrow streams wound their way through clusters of reeds. How the wind curled around the olive trees and brushed its fingertips through their silver leaves. For a boy as observant as Leonardo, this world was not simply the backdrop of early life. It was a living textbook, a teacher without words, endlessly patient, always offering something new to study. Each dawn carried with it the promise of a new pattern to notice, a new rhythm to decipher, a new question waiting quietly to be born in the corners of his mind. He wandered the hills barefoot, feeling the coolness of morning soil beneath his feet, stopping often to crouch beside a stream and watch the water thread itself around stones. He watched the flow not with the idle gaze of childhood, but with a seriousness unusual for someone so young, following the shapes the water made as if reading a secret language. The villagers thought the boy dreamy, gentle, perhaps a little strange, but harmless. They saw him lying in a meadow studying the movement of clouds, or pacing slowly beside a row of cypresses with his head tilted upward, or sketching shapes in the dirt with a stick, lost entirely in the curve of a line. His father, a notary, recognized the boy's curiosity, but could not yet understand its depth. His mother, a quiet woman of modest means, simply smiled at his questions. Questions about why birds fold their wings the way they do when they land, why shadows stretch longer in the late afternoon, why water circles before sinking into the earth. These were not questions adults could easily answer, but Leonardo did not seem troubled by that. He carried them with him, letting them settle, letting them grow. The Tuscan countryside gave him room to think. It offered him silence, not an empty silence, but one filled with the subtle sounds that humans rarely listen to. The low hum of bees gathering early nectar, the rustle of small creatures moving through tall grass, the creak of distant wooden carts rolling slowly down a dirt road. Leonardo absorbed these sounds, storing them somewhere deep within him, perhaps without realizing how they would one day form part of the intricate tapestry of his observation. To him, every detail held meaning. The shape of a leaf was not simply a leaf, it was a puzzle resolved by veins and curves. The flight of a bird was not simply grace, It was a physics problem expressed in feathers and air. Even the way the light fell across a stone wall could spark hours of contemplation. There were days when he ventured farther from the village, climbing the hills until Vinci appeared below as a cluster of warm-coloured rooftops nestled between vineyards. From these heights, he could see the full sweep of the valley, the winding paths, the patches of cultivated land, the scatter of farmhouses rising like anchors in the soft expanse of green. It was here, with the wind brushing through his untamed hair, that he began to sense the world as a kind of vast mechanism, each part connected to the next in ways not immediately visible. The sun warming the earth influenced the vines fed the people shaped the land shaped the weather shaped the rivers. Everything moved together. Everything had a structure. Everything could be understood if one only looked closely enough. Leonardo's first drawings were made not on fine parchment, but on scraps of whatever he could find. Pieces of wood, smoothed stones, stray bits of paper left behind by travellers. He sketched the hills, the curves of tree branches, the shapes of animals moving through fields, the patterns he saw in water. These early attempts were not polished, but they were sincere, marked by the careful hand of someone who respected the world too much to rush in capturing it. The villagers sometimes watched him with amusement, especially when he paused mid-step, transfixed by something as simple as the way sunlight shifted across a puddle. They could not know that these moments, insignificant to them, would shape one of the greatest minds of all time. Even at a young age, Leonardo felt a kind of quiet kinship with nature. He sensed its order, its unpredictability, its beauty, its mystery. He did not yet articulate these feelings in words, but he expressed them through attention, through the way he knelt beside insects without fear, the way he traced the edges of leaves with his fingertips, the way he tilted his head to listen not only to songs of birds, but to the varying tones of wind as it passed through different trees. His mind was forming habits that would stay with him for life. The habit of questioning, the habit of observing, the habit of refusing to take anything at face value. At night, when the hills fell quiet and stars appeared like slow-burning embers scattered across the sky, Leonardo often lay beside the doorway of his home, staring upward. The sky fascinated him as deeply as the earth did. He watched the constellations shift with the seasons, trying to understand their patterns, wondering if the heavens obeyed the same invisible rules that governed the rivers and the birds and the shapes of plants. To a child in a small village, the stars might have felt distant, unreachable, but to Leonardo, they felt like part of the same system he was beginning to unravel. His childhood in Vinci was not marked by wealth or prestige, not shaped by the expectations of scholars or the guidance of great teachers. It was shaped instead by hills, streams, trees, and sky, by a landscape that taught him how to see before anyone taught him how to draw, how to think, how to analyze. It taught him that beauty was not separate from structure, that wonder and logic could live in the same breath, that the world was a masterpiece waiting to be studied stroke by stroke. The seeds planted in those quiet Tuscan mornings would grow into a mind capable of imagining machines centuries ahead of their time, a mind that saw connections long before others recognized them, a mind that believed, even in childhood, that everything was worth observing. And so, Leonardo grew not through instruction, but through immersion, immersed in nature, immersed in curiosity, immersed in the quiet unfolding of questions that would follow him all his life. His story began not in a studio or a palace or a workshop, but in the soft light of Tuscan dawn, among whispering streams and hills that seemed to breathe with the slow, ancient rhythm of the earth itself. Curiosity, in most children, flickers like a small flame, bright for a moment, then gone. But in Leonardo, it burned with a quiet steadiness that seemed almost older than he was, as though he had inherited not just the world's beauty, but its questions as well. Long before he understood the language of scholars or the craft of painters, he was already studying the shapes that surrounded him with the seriousness of someone convinced that nothing existed without reason. He watched the world the way others listened to music, not passively, but with his entire being attuned to subtleties most eyes would glide over. The bend of a river's path, the angle of a bird's wing as it shifted direction mid-flight, the way dust swirled into tiny spirals when sunlight warmed the village square. Everything held meaning for him. Everything suggested patterns waiting quietly to be noticed. He spent hours tracing shadows, following their movement across walls as the day progressed. Other children saw only darkness and outline. Leonardo saw the shifting tone of light itself, the way morning shadows stretched thin and evening shadows pooled thick and soft, almost like spilled ink. He would place his hand above different surfaces just to see how the light carved his fingers into new shapes depending on its angle. The villagers sometimes laughed when they saw him moving slowly around buildings, as if stalking something invisible. But the boy didn't mind. He was chasing understanding. He was learning the language of light long before he learned how to manipulate it with paint. Shapes fascinated him even more. He filled pieces of bark and scraps of parchment with sketches of circles, spirals, triangles, twisting vines, shells, and stones. He found geometry inside everything, inside the petals of flowers, inside the arcs birds traced in the sky, inside the way branches split from trunks. He had no formal words for what he observed, no mathematical vocabulary to explain the ratios and curves that enthralled him, but he saw them all the same. Sometimes he arranged pebbles on the ground, creating patterns that mirrored what he witnessed in nature. Spirals like snail shells, branching shapes like river systems, or repetitive forms that reminded him of ripples on a pond. His father watched him sometimes with a mixture of confusion and pride, sensing that the boy's mind was wandering somewhere beyond the limits of their small village. Movement captivated him most of all. He watched animals with a focus so complete it was almost unsettling to those who passed by. He followed lizards along stone walls, studying the rhythm of their limbs. He knelt near horses, mesmerized by the rise and fall of their muscles as they shifted weight from one leg to another. He watched people too, the way they tossed hay, carried baskets, gestured while speaking. He noticed that every movement contained a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that each phase had its own logic. When he tried to draw these actions, his attempts were crude at first, but he could see the hidden mechanics behind them. Even as a child, Leonardo sensed that art was more than capturing appearance. It was capturing motion, intention, and the invisible energy that lived within forms. The people of Vinci were not accustomed to such intense observation, and some found him strange, but no one denied that the boy possessed an uncommon attentiveness. He asked questions that startled adults, questions about why water always found the lowest place, why birds glided without flapping their wings, why shadows lengthened just before sunset, why the moon sometimes appeared larger when it rose over the hills. These were not the questions of idle curiosity. They were the early echoes of a mind that would one day seek to understand everything, not through superstition or hearsay, but through direct experience. There were evenings when Leonardo sat beside the village well, watching the rope descend as buckets dipped into the darkness below. He studied the circular motion of the pulley, the tension in the rope, the downward force of the bucket. He didn't yet know the terms friction, leverage, or mechanics, but he recognized the essence of these concepts in the simple act of drawing water. He imagined different ways to lift the bucket, to ease the strain on the person pulling, to improve the shape of the wheel so it rotated more smoothly. These early imaginings were seeds of the engineering genius that would emerge later, hidden within the small observations of a child who believed that every problem had a more elegant solution if one only looked closely enough. Even the wind fascinated him. He stood in open fields, letting it push gently against his face, studying how it bent tall grass in fluid waves, how it scattered leaves, how it shaped clouds. He once tried to catch the wind by releasing small pieces of dried leaves and running after them, watching their unpredictable movements. It was, to any passerby, a child's game. But to Leonardo, it was an early study of turbulence, still centuries from recognition in scientific terms. His mother often found him sitting quietly by the edge of a stream, not playing, but watching. He watched how the water forked around stones, how eddies formed behind obstacles, how the surface shimmered with patterns that repeated and dissolved within moments. Sometimes he dipped a stick in the water and dragged it along the surface, studying how the ripples intersected. These ripples, unknowingly to him then, would one day appear in his studies of hydraulics, in his sketches of water flow, and even in his ideas for machines powered by fluid motion. Villagers began to accept that Leonardo was simply different, gentle, observant, content with silence. He did not join the boys who chased each other through the fields or played loud games in the town square. His joy came from watching the world unfold, from letting nature reveal its quiet secrets. Yet he was not lonely. The world itself was his companion, and it spoke to him in details others rarely noticed. A spider weaving a web, a bird landing on a branch, the shifting texture of clouds. All of it became part of his private education, a curriculum written by nature itself. Sometimes at dusk, when the sky softened into purples and deepening blues, Leonardo found himself overwhelmed by a sense of wonder, so deep it made him still entirely. He did not yet know that the shapes, shadows, motions, and patterns he adored would one day become the foundation of masterpieces and inventions the world had never imagined. He only knew that the world was endlessly, impossibly fascinating. And perhaps that was enough for now. A boy who saw everything. A boy who listened to the world before trying to explain it. A boy whose curiosity stretched farther than the Tuscan hills ever could. It was in these early moments, sketching spirals in the dirt, chasing beams of light across stone walls, watching water swirl around pebbles, that the seeds of the future Leonardo da Vinci quietly took root. Florence, in Leonardo's adolescence, was a city humming with possibility, a place where art, craft, commerce and conversation intertwined in narrow streets paved with warm, uneven stone. The air carried the scent of wet clay, wool dye, and freshly baked bread, and the constant murmur of merchants, scholars, and travellers echoed through the city like a living pulse. To arrive here from the quiet hills of Vinci was to be thrust suddenly into a world overflowing with colour and movement. A world where every corner revealed something new to learn, something shaped by human hands and imagination. And it was in this vibrant city, under the glowing Tuscan sun, that Leonardo's early fascination with observation finally found direction, for Florence was home to one of the greatest workshops of its era, the studio of Andrea del Verrocchio. Entering Verrocchio's workshop was less a moment and more a sensation, a feeling of stepping into the very centre of creation itself. The doors opened onto a space alive with dust, light, and the soft cacophony of tools in motion. Hammers rang against metal, chisels whispered across stone, brushes clicked lightly against the rims of pigment jars. Apprentices moved through the space with practiced purpose, grinding minerals into powder, stretching canvases, heating wax, cleaning brushes, mixing varnishes. The air shimmered with the warmth of small furnaces, with the earthy smells of clay and plaster, with the faint tang of metal filings that clung to fingertips. Everything here seemed to work toward one shared purpose, the bringing of ideas into form. Leonardo, still young and untested, looked around the workshop with wide, attentive eyes. He saw things he had never imagined: a half-finished bronze figure draped in cloth, a wooden frame supporting the early stages of a fresco, a set of delicate tools arranged neatly along a bench, each one shaped for a specific task. Even the scraps piled in corners, broken statues, discarded sketches, half-used blocks of marble, seemed to pulse with potential. Verrocchio's studio was not merely a place of work. It was a world in constant transformation, where materials surrendered themselves to hands capable of making beauty, strength, and meaning. From the first day, Leonardo approached his apprenticeship not as a series of assigned tasks, but as an opportunity to unravel the mechanics of creation itself. His fellow apprentices often began by learning specific, narrow skills: how to mix pigments properly, how to polish a bronze surface, how to apply a smooth layer of gesso to a panel. But Leonardo absorbed each task as if it were part of a vast, interconnected system. If he ground pigments, he wanted to understand why different stones produced different hues and how those hues behaved under light. If he prepared a canvas, he studied the tension of fibers, the structure of the frame, the absorption of the surface. Nothing was simple to him. Nothing was merely a step in a process. Every task hinted at deeper principles, and he followed those hints with the same attentive curiosity that had guided his childhood. Verrocchio noticed this quickly. The master was accustomed to apprentices who followed instructions carefully, but Leonardo did more than follow. He observed, interpreted, experimented. When told to mix a particular shade of blue, he would quietly create several variations, studying how each responded to shadow, or how the pigment's texture changed under different proportions of oil. When assigned to assist in sculpting, he watched not only the master's hands, but the subtle changes in the marble as each chip fell away. His hands were steady, precise, unusually expressive for his age. But it was his eyes that truly set him apart, eyes that seemed to see not only what something was, but what it could become. The workshop became his second home. He arrived early, leaving his modest lodgings while the sky was still pale with morning light, and he often stayed late, long after the other apprentices had gone to their evening meals. In the quiet hours, when the furnaces cooled and the dust settled, Leonardo wandered the workshop like a gentle ghost, studying unfinished works, holding tools in his hands, running his fingers across the grain of wood or the cold surface of marble. He kept sketchbooks filled with drawings, studies of drapery, hands, horses, faces, plants, tools, drawn with such attention to detail that older apprentices often paused to watch him. There was something different in the way he drew. His lines carried motion, emotion, life. Even in stillness, Leonardo found movement. His curiosity extended far beyond art. Verrocchio encouraged his apprentices to understand not just how to create, but why things looked the way they did. Leonardo devoured this opportunity. He studied mechanics, geometry, anatomy, architecture, and even music. On days when the workshop received visitors, scholars, patrons, travelers, Leonardo listened intently to their conversations, absorbing fragments of knowledge from mathematics to philosophy. He asked questions quietly, respectfully, but with a depth that often startled the adults speaking to him. It was as if the workshop had opened a door inside him, and behind that door stretched a landscape of endless questions. One of Leonardo's greatest early challenges was learning how to paint flesh, a task Verrocchio approached with deliberate precision. The master insisted that light, shadow, and subtle gradation of tone were the true indicators of skill. Under his guidance, Leonardo learned how to observe human skin as a field of gentle transitions rather than flat color. He practiced for hours, studying faces in profile, the curve of a cheek, the fold of an eyelid, the soft dimples at the corners of a mouth. Slowly, his work began to reveal something new, a softness that felt alive, a quiet inner light emerging from the paint itself. As months turned to years, Leonardo's capabilities grew so rapidly that even Verrocchio, renowned for his mastery, found himself astonished. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but deeply telling, that during the painting of the baptism of Christ, Verrocchio asked Leonardo to paint one of the angels. When he saw the finished figure, so delicate, so luminous, so alive compared to his own work, the master laid down his brush and declared he would never paint again. Whether the story is literal truth or not, its essence captures something undeniable. Leonardo had begun to surpass even those who taught him, not through arrogance, but through vision, through a way of seeing the world that transcended technique. Yet Leonardo remained humble. He learned eagerly, worked diligently, and never boasted. His joy came not from impressing others, but from the quiet exhilaration of uncovering how things worked, how metal bent under heat, how fabric folded along lines of tension, how bones supported muscles, how light shaped perception. In Verrocchio's workshop, Leonardo found not only instruction, but direction. He discovered that art and science were not separate pursuits, but two expressions of the same longing, the desire to understand and to give form to that understanding. By the time he reached young adulthood, his path had become clear. Florence had shaped him, Verrocchio had honed him, and the workshop had revealed the boundless terrain of possibility within him. Leonardo emerged not merely as an apprentice who had learned a craft, but as a mind awakened to the vastness of creation itself, a mind ready to step beyond the walls of the workshop and into a world that could not yet imagine how deeply he would change it. And so, the boy from Vinci, who once traced shadows on village walls, now stood at the threshold of a life that would illuminate centuries. There came a time, Not long after Leonardo had settled into Verrocchio's workshop, when those around him began to realize that his hands possessed a rare and quiet magic, a kind of intuitive intelligence that allowed them to shape whatever material they touched into something finer, clearer, more alive than anyone expected. It was not simply skill, though he had that in abundance. It was an almost uncanny sensitivity, a harmonious relationship between mind and hand that made even the most difficult tasks seem like natural extensions of thought. When he held a piece of charcoal, the shadows it created became soft, fluid, filled with breath. When he shaped clay, the curves emerged with a grace that seemed to belong more to nature than to human effort. When he handled metal tools, wood responded with a smoothness that surprised even the seasoned craftsmen who watched him. The boy who once traced the movements of birds and rivers now brought that attentiveness into every gesture, and the world began, subtly and slowly, to reveal its deeper structures to him. Leonardo's hands learned quickly because they observed as intensely as his eyes. He never repeated emotion without first understanding it. He never carved, painted, or constructed without absorbing the logic embedded in the task. Apprentices often rushed through exercises, eager to impress Verrocchio, but Leonardo approached each task as though it contained a secret. When he applied gesso to a panel, he studied how the liquid pooled before settling into a smooth surface. When he carved a delicate feature into clay, he paused between strokes, watching how the material held its form. When he mixed pigments, he tested their reactions under different lights, seeking the exact hue that matched what he saw, not just with his eyes, but with his memory of nature. Completing the task was never his goal. Understanding it was. This approach made him a master of versatility, an artist who could do everything and learn anything, not out of pride or ambition, but out of the sheer joy that accompanied discovery. It was not enough for Leonardo to paint a face. He needed to understand the muscles beneath the skin, the anatomy that shaped the expression, the emotion that animated the gaze. It was not enough for him to draw a bird. He needed to understand the aerodynamics that allowed its wings to carry it effortlessly through air. It was not enough to sculpt a figure in clay. He needed to visualize its structure, weight distribution, and movement as though it were alive. Art was never separate from science to him. Every curve held physics within it. Every shadow reflected an unseen law. The workshop soon became a playground for Leonardo's expanding mind. He sculpted small figures with startling precision, capturing gestures with such naturalness that older apprentices found themselves studying his work to understand what made their own appear stiff or lifeless. He designed elaborate knots and ornamental patterns that intertwined mathematical logic with aesthetic beauty. His sketches grew increasingly complex, not because he wished to show off, but because complexity fascinated him. He filled page after page with studies of hands, faces, drapery, plants, animals, machines. Each page held dozens of variations on a single theme, as if his mind was circling an idea from every angle, trying to grasp its fullest possible expression. What astonished Verrocchio most was not Leonardo's artistic talent, but his inventiveness. While other apprentices focused on honing traditional skills, Leonardo's mind wandered freely into realms most people never imagined. He sketched gears and pulleys, imagining ways to lift heavy objects more efficiently. He designed fantastical contraptions, water-scooping devices, improved looms, mechanical wings that appeared impossible, yet were drawn with such precision that they hinted at feasibility. Even the tools in the workshop began to change subtly as Leonardo suggested small improvements: a better handle shape, a smoother curve, a hinge redesigned to reduce friction. These adjustments were minor, almost invisible, but they reflected his deeper instinct that everything, no matter how simple, could be understood more completely and refined more elegantly. In the evenings, when the workshop grew quiet and dust settled like a fine mist across wooden benches, Leonardo often lingered, experimenting with small mechanisms. He would turn a crank and watch gears rotate, studying how motion transferred from one part to another. He would drop small objects into water to observe the ripples and record their patterns. He began creating tiny models of bridges, cranes, and lifting devices, each crafted with meticulous attention to balance and tension. Other apprentices found these habits peculiar, but Leonardo felt a calm clarity during these hours, a sense that he was glimpsing the hidden architecture of the world. His inventiveness extended beyond the practical into the realm of imagination. Leonardo often saw possibilities where others saw constraints. He studied the wings of birds, not just to draw them, but to understand how flight worked. He wondered whether a human could fly with the right mechanical aid, and began sketching designs that looked like dreamlike hybrids of nature and machinery. Though the technology of his time could never realize these visions, Leonardo drew them with the same level of detail he applied to portraits and sculptures. In his mind, the boundary between art and invention did not exist. Creativity was a single force, branching into many forms. Even sound fascinated him. Leonardo learned to play the lyre and constructed instruments with unusual shapes, believing that the quality of resonance was linked to geometric form. He once crafted a silver lyre shaped like a horse's skull, its eerie, beautiful tone surprising even the musicians who tried to master it. Music, like light and motion, belonged to the same universe of patterns he could not stop exploring. As his abilities grew, so did his confidence. Not a loud or boastful confidence, but a quiet understanding that he could learn whatever he wished. If he observed something long enough, if he listened to it, touched it, imagined it, his hands could bring it into the world. People began to notice the young man, not merely as a skilled apprentice, but as someone whose potential seemed almost unbounded. Even his mistakes fascinated him. When a sculpture cracked, he studied the fracture to understand why. When paint behaved unpredictably, he analyzed its ingredients. Failures became lessons. Lessons became foundations. Foundations became stepping stones toward ever larger ideas. Yet Leonardo's gift did not isolate him. He remained gentle, unassuming, often amused by his own wandering thoughts. He did not seek praise. He sought clarity. He did not envy other artists. He admired them. He did not fear difficult tasks. He embraced them as opportunities to see more deeply. His hands, which could grind pigments, carve marble, design machines, and coax music from strings, became symbols of a mind in constant motion, reaching outward toward everything the world offered. One day, as Verrocchio watched Leonardo work silently on a small sculpture, measuring proportions with a gaze that seemed to penetrate beneath the surface, the master felt a rare certainty. This young man, modest, soft-spoken, endlessly curious, possessed a gift that surpassed technique. He possessed a mind that could imagine futures yet unseen, a mind that could connect disciplines no one else realized were linked, a mind that would one day create art so lifelike and inventions so ahead of their time that people would struggle to believe they came from the same century. In Leonardo's hands, possibilities multiplied. Clay, metal, pigment, parchment, everything became a doorway. And as he moved deeper into his studies and broader into his visions, the world would eventually recognize that those hands, gentle and tireless, did not merely create objects. There came a moment in Leonardo's journey when the surfaces of things no longer satisfied him. It was not enough to draw a smile without understanding the muscles that lifted it. Not enough to paint a hand without knowing how tendons stretched beneath the skin. Not enough to sculpt a body without grasping the architecture that allowed it to move with grace. For Leonardo, beauty and truth were inseparable. And truth, he realized, lived beneath the surface, hidden in layers of bone, flesh and sinew that no ordinary artist dared to explore. And so, quietly, almost furtively, he began a chapter of study that would shape him more deeply than any apprenticeship, more intimately than any commission. The study of the human body, conducted in nocturnal secrecy, guided only by oil lamp, curiosity, and an almost spiritual devotion to understanding life itself. Anatomical study in the Renaissance was not welcomed. It lingered in the shadows of fear, superstition, and moral discomfort. Bodies were sacred to some, taboo to others, and deeply unsettling to most. But Leonardo was not deterred by such boundaries. He approached the human form with reverence, not irreverence, with a sensitivity so profound that even the stillness of death did not repel him. He believed that the body was nature's most complex mechanism, a universe of interlocking systems designed with a perfection that surpassed any sculpture or cathedral. And so, late at night, when Florence slipped into silence and the workshop emptied, Leonardo slipped away to places where few dared to go. Small rooms behind hospitals, dim corners of monasteries, spaces where unclaimed or condemned bodies were brought not for burial, but for study. He would arrive carrying his sketchbooks, his knives sharpened with precision, and a lamp whose flame trembled with each low breath of air. The room always felt colder than the night outside, a heavy, motionless cold that clung to his skin and made shadows gather in thick pools along the walls. Yet Leonardo entered these spaces without fear. The quiet weight of death did not disturb him. If anything, it deepened his sense of purpose. Before him often lay a body that had once carried its own stories, its joys, griefs, labors, and small daily routines, but now served as a silent teacher, offering its internal architecture to the one man patient enough to learn from it. With movements slow and deliberate, Leonardo would begin to uncover what nature had concealed from ordinary sight. He traced the strong curve of ribs beneath soft tissue, revealing the cage that protected breath itself. He separated layers of muscle along the arm, studying how one contracted while another elongated, how tension translated into movement. He examined the heart with an intensity no artist before him had dared to apply, mapping its chambers, valves, and swirling currents of blood with a clarity centuries ahead of medical understanding. Everything he touched, he sketched, sometimes dozens of times from different angles, as though rotating the body within his mind until every part fit perfectly into his growing internal map of human mechanics. These drawings, done in the dim glow of lamplight, carried a tenderness that defied the setting. They were not clinical, though they were precise. They were not morbid, though they dealt with death. They were acts of reverence. Leonardo believed that to understand the body was to honor the miracle of life, and so each sketch was a kind of quiet prayer, an offering of attention so deep it bordered on devotion. His lines were delicate, almost affectionate, tracing structures with the respect one might give to a sleeping child, not a lifeless form. Even in decay, he saw order. Even in stillness, he saw motion waiting to be understood. Sometimes, after hours of study, Leonardo would pause and sit back on his stool, his hands stained with ink, his breath unsteady from concentration. He would lift his lamp and look again at what lay before him, not with sorrow or detachment, but with a profound sense of humility. The human body, he realized, was a masterpiece of natural engineering, more intricate than the gears of any machine, more fluid than any sculpture, more expressive than any painting. And he wondered, often in silence, how many artists before him had attempted to portray the human form without understanding it. How many thinkers had pondered existence without ever glimpsing the mechanisms that made life possible. Yet, for all his devotion, Leonardo kept this work secret, not out of shame, but out of understanding. He knew that the world around him was not ready to see the body as he saw it, not ready to accept the merging of art and anatomy, not ready to confront the quiet logic beneath flesh. Religious authorities watched these practices with suspicion, moralists whispered warnings, and ordinary people felt unease at the thought of a man studying the dead with such intensity. So Leonardo tucked his drawings into hidden folios, wrote notes in mirror script, and shared his findings with only a handful of trusted associates. He was not afraid of judgment. He simply did not wish the noise of the world to interrupt his dialogue with truth. But the impact of his anatomical study seeped into everything he created. His paintings gained a realism that felt almost uncanny to viewers of his time, a softness of skin, a precision of muscle tension, a serenity of expression that suggested not simply talent, but knowledge. When he painted a hand, the tendons beneath the surface guided his brush. When he painted a smile, the subtle interplay of muscles gave it depth and mystery. The Mona Lisa would one day become the world's most famous portrait, not because of its beauty alone, but because Leonardo understood the mechanics of a living face better than any artist before or after him. His inventions, too, bore the imprint of his anatomical insights. The gears he drew reflected joints. The wings he imagined drew from the musculature of birds. The mechanical knight he designed echoed the structure of the human skeleton. To Leonardo, the human body was not a subject of study alone. It was a blueprint for understanding all forms of motion and structure, a key to unlocking the mechanics of nature itself. And yet, despite the brilliance of these nocturnal studies, Leonardo remained quiet about them. He kept his discoveries tucked away in notebooks, waiting for a world centuries away that would finally understand what he had seen, what he had touched, what he had imagined. Night after night, he returned to the silent rooms, guided not by fame, not by ambition, but by a deeper, more enduring impulse, the longing to understand life at its most fundamental level, to see the structure behind the surface, to witness the harmony that existed even in death, to learn what nature had written inside every living being. Leonardo da Vinci studied anatomy not because he sought mastery, but because he sought truth. And in those quiet, secret hours, beneath trembling lamplight, he discovered that the body was not merely a vessel, not merely a form. It was a universe made of wonder. Florence at dawn held a special kind of magic, the kind that unfolded slowly, as if the city itself were waking from a long and thoughtful dream. Leonardo loved these early hours more than any other part of the day. While the rest of the workshop slept, while merchants still rolled over in their beds, and the clang of hammers had not yet begun to echo across narrow streets, Leonardo slipped quietly into the waking city, letting the cool morning air gather around him like a familiar cloak. The streets were still muted, washed in soft blue light, with shadows stretching lazily between the stone buildings. The silence was not empty. It carried the faint promise of distant footsteps, of whispered conversations soon to be born, of ovens warming behind wooden doors. Florence, so vibrant and demanding in the heat of daytime, became something gentler at dawn, something patient, contemplative, almost shy. And in this softened world, Leonardo found space to think in ways the workshop never allowed. He walked without haste, absorbing details with the hungry curiosity that had shaped him since childhood. The cobblestones glistened faintly from the night's moisture, each one holding a subtle pattern he memorized without effort. He watched how the first rays of sunlight brushed the tops of buildings, striking windows that flashed briefly like small fires before the light settled into warmth. He stopped to observe pigeons fluttering atop roof tiles, not because he was distracted, but because the arc of their wings revealed something about motion he had not yet understood fully. Even the curled smoke rising from a distant chimney became a lesson. Its spirals, its dispersal, the invisible architecture of air that shaped it. Everything around him seemed to offer insight, and he accepted each detail with quiet gratitude. As he made his way through the narrow alleys that wound like threads through the heart of Florence, Leonardo often paused to listen. He listened to the drip of water from a rooftop gutter, to the distant bark of a waking dog, to the soft thud of a cartwheel beginning its slow journey across stone. Sound, to him, was another form of movement, another system of patterns waiting to be deciphered. He remembered how, during his earliest days in Verrocchio's workshop, he had stood at the window listening to the city rise, trying to separate and identify each sound: hammer, bell, voice, wind. Now, as familiarity settled into him, he no longer dissected every noise individually. Instead, he let them wash together into a kind of living music. The city was not merely a place to him, it was a phenomenon. And Florence, in those first hours of daylight, revealed layers most people never noticed. The butcher shops, still shuttered, held the faint scent of sawdust and smoke. The spice merchants, preparing their stalls, released small bursts of scent into the air: pepper, saffron, dried herbs that seemed to whisper of far-off lands Leonardo hoped one day to see. Bakers pulled warm loaves from ovens, and for a few precious moments, the entire neighborhood smelled of rising dough and heat, a fragrance so comforting that Leonardo often lingered near bakery doors just to breathe it in. Market women arranged their vegetables in careful rows, their hands moving with practiced confidence. Leather workers aired their shops, revealing the earthy smell of tanned hides. Even the Arno River, flowing beneath Florence's bridges, seemed different at dawn, slower, more reflective, its surface catching colors the midday sun would quickly erase. These morning walks shaped Leonardo's artistic and scientific mind as deeply as any formal training. He observed how light transformed objects, from the soft gradients of early dawn to the crisp shadows of full daylight. He saw how color changed with moisture in the air, how reflections rippled across windows and polished surfaces. He studied faces too, the weary baker brushing flour from his sleeves, the merchant's wife adjusting her shawl, the curious child peering from behind a doorway. Leonardo memorized expressions, gestures, the subtle language of human movement. Later, when he painted or sculpted, these observations flowed naturally from his memory, forming the foundation of his uncanny ability to capture life. But Leonardo's walks were not merely observational, they were reflective as well. Florence was a city of ideas: art, architecture, mathematics, philosophy. And he felt these ideas stirring within him as he moved through its streets. Sometimes he paused on a quiet bridge, leaning over the stone parapet to watch the water shift beneath him. The river was a puzzle he could never exhaust. He studied its currents, fascinated by how water split around obstacles, rejoined, then spun into gentle vortices before settling again into smooth flow. He thought about how the same principles governed air, sound, even the motion of people through narrow streets. The world revealed itself in patterns, and these patterns repeated across scales so different that one could easily mistake them for unrelated phenomena, unless one looked with the eyes of someone who believed, as Leonardo did, that all things were connected. He often carried a small notebook with him, tucked beneath his cloak. When a detail struck him, a new shadow shape, a curious mechanism on a cartwheel, the way morning light filtered unevenly through cloth awnings, he sketched it quickly, scribbling notes in mirror script. These notes were not polished, not intended for any reader but himself. They were fragments of thought, seeds of questions he would return to later. He wrote about how the wings of birds folded mid-flight, how lips curved during speech, how the shape of a flower petal suggested a hidden symmetry. Sometimes he wrote reflections too, quiet musings on the nature of beauty, on the habits of the human mind, on why some people seemed blind to the wonders unfolding around them each day. And always, beneath these observations, there lingered a gentle sense of longing. Leonardo felt the world opening itself to him, offering glimpses of deeper truths, yet he sensed that no single life would be long enough to grasp everything he wished to understand. Still, this longing did not discourage him. It energized him. It pushed him to explore, to learn, to wander Florence's waking streets with the same curiosity he carried into his workshop. The city became his teacher, his companion, his quiet collaborator. As the sun rose higher and the city slipped fully into its lively rhythm, Leonardo would eventually turn back toward Verrocchio's workshop. The streets grew louder, busier, filled with shouts of merchants and clatter of carts. But Leonardo walked through the growing noise with a calm that came from having already filled his mind with the quiet lessons of morning. He returned to the workshop, not as an apprentice bound by routine, but as an observer carrying fresh insights, ready to translate what he had seen into art, invention, and written thought. These dawn wanderings shaped him more than he ever admitted. They taught him how to see, not only with his eyes, but with the deeper sense that perceives structure, connection, possibility. And Florence, waking slowly under a Tuscan sun, became the silent cradle of that vision, offering the young Leonardo a daily reminder that the world, in all its complexity, was waiting to be understood. In those quiet hours, long before history knew his name, Leonardo da Vinci was learning to read the universe. In the busy days of Verrocchio's workshop, Leonardo often appeared to be doing exactly what was asked of him: mixing pigments, preparing canvases, sketching studies for upcoming commissions. Yet anyone who watched closely would notice that his mind wandered far beyond the tasks before him. While he worked, his thoughts drifted into territories no one else in the studio imagined, territories filled with wheels and gears and strange mechanisms that clicked softly in the quiet chambers of his mind. And so, in the margins of his notebooks, in the blank spaces surrounding careful studies of drapery or anatomy, something extraordinary began to appear. The first sketches of machines not yet born, the earliest fragments of a future that Leonardo could sense long before it arrived. These small drawings, barely larger than a thumbprint at first, were seeds that would one day reveal the vastness of his imagination. The margins held his secrets. While the workshop hummed with predictable work, statues to be refined, fresco outlines to be completed, pigments to be ground, Leonardo's hand would suddenly drift to the side of the page, drawing a pulley system that no one had taught him, or a gear assembly with teeth shaped to reduce friction, or a strange flying contraption with wings stretched like those of a giant bat. These sketches emerged as though carried by a wind only he could feel, and though he rarely spoke about them, they accumulated quietly, page after page, revealing a mind unwilling to accept the limitations of the present. What fascinated Leonardo most was motion, not just physical movement, but the principles that governed it. He believed that everything, from the curve of a falling leaf to the mechanics of a water wheel, followed rules that could be understood, broken down, and reconstructed. And so, he began inventing with an innocence unburdened by feasibility. He drew machines to lift heavy stones more efficiently, imagining a Florence where cathedrals rose faster and safer because engineers understood balance and leverage. He designed cranes with counterweights, dredging devices to clear rivers, improved looms to ease the strain of weavers. He even sketched self-propelled carts powered by coiled springs, a distant, almost mythical ancestor of the automobiles that would come centuries later. To anyone else, these drawings were curiosities, perhaps even signs of a young man distracted from his true artistic path. But to Leonardo, they were glimpses of possibility, hints of what humanity might someday achieve if it dared to question its own limitations. He often found inspiration not in grand ideas, but in the simplest of moments. A spool of thread rolling across the workshop floor revealed to him the mechanics of rotational motion. A carpenter's saw suggested that motion could be converted from linear to alternating with the right arrangement of joints. Watching water spill unevenly from a bucket gave him the idea for a device that could regulate flow with perfect consistency. Leonardo saw engineering not as a craft, but as an extension of nature's logic, another way in which the shapes, rhythms, and patterns he had studied since childhood expressed themselves. But flight, above all flight, captivated him. Ever since he had watched birds soar over the Tuscan hills, something deep within him yearned to understand how a creature could defy gravity with nothing more than air beneath its wings. He studied birds obsessively, filling pages with notes on how they angled their wings, how they tucked their legs, how their feathers adjusted to changes in wind. These observations slowly morphed into sketches of machines that looked both fantastical and eerily prescient. Giant wings attached to wooden frames, pulleys that mimicked the motion of muscles, levers that imitated the sweep of a bird's flight. Leonardo did not yet know what materials or forces would be necessary to make such a machine work, but he sensed that understanding the principles was the first step toward conquering the sky. And so he drew, not because he believed he would fly in his lifetime, but because something within him insisted that humans were meant, someday, to rise above the earth. These inventions, scattered across pages like fragments of dreams, were both playful and profound. They revealed a mind that refused the boundaries of its century, a mind that saw the future not as a distant era, but as an extension of the present, reachable through curiosity, patience, and observation. And yet, Leonardo did not announce his ideas with the enthusiasm of someone seeking praise. He shared them cautiously, when he shared them at all, knowing that others might dismiss them as fantasies. But the notebooks grew regardless, filled with sketches that seemed to come from someone living in two times at once, the world of Renaissance Florence and a world centuries ahead. Occasionally, Verrocchio would catch sight of this work. He would pause behind Leonardo as the young apprentice sketched gears or winged machines, and for a moment the master sculptor would say nothing. He could not fully understand what Leonardo was trying to create. No one could. But he sensed that the young man was exploring territory far beyond the confines of traditional art. He never discouraged him. He simply watched with a mixture of bewilderment and admiration, recognizing genius in its raw, unpolished form. Leonardo's talent was not merely skill. It was an unrestrained desire to understand how the universe worked, to replicate nature's mechanisms through human ingenuity. But these inventions were more than engineering concepts. They reflected Leonardo's longing for order, his belief that beauty lay not only in what the eye could see, but in the structure beneath it. For every machine he sketched, there was a deeper question woven into the lines. Questions about the nature of force, the reliability of materials, the relationship between motion and energy. Leonardo wanted not just to build machines, but to understand them from the inside out, to know why they must work a certain way, to comprehend the invisible laws that shaped every visible phenomenon. As the years passed, the machines in the margins grew more ambitious. Leonardo drew armored vehicles shaped like turtles, designed to protect soldiers in battle with rotating cannons that spun like the chambers of later artillery. He sketched bridges that could be assembled in moments, allowing armies or travelers to cross rivers swiftly. He imagined diving suits that would let men breathe underwater, giant bows that launched stones, mechanical lions that could walk forward and open their chests to reveal flowers. To any casual viewer, these ideas were extravagances, curiosities, perhaps the indulgent fantasies of a talented but restless artist. But to Leonardo, they were expressions of a future that seemed as real to him as the paint-stained walls of Verrocchio's workshop. These inventions, though unbuilt in his lifetime, shaped his mind in ways that would later influence his greatest works. They taught him to see simultaneously on scales large and small, to consider both the curve of a feather and the mechanics of a machine meant to lift thousands of pounds. They taught him that art was more than representation. It was understanding. and they taught him that imagination was not a luxury, but a form of inquiry, a way of expanding the boundaries of knowledge. So Leonardo continued to draw, filling margins with ideas no one else would understand for centuries. He did so not because he wished to astonish the world, but because he could not stop seeing what others overlooked. The future whispered to him through the wings of birds, the turning of wheels, the flow of water, and he listened with a heart open to possibility. In the quiet corners of notebooks, between sketches of angels and studies of anatomy, a new world took shape, a world where humans would fly, where machines would lift more than men could dream of, where ideas could leap across centuries. And it began, as so many things did for Leonardo, with the simple act of noticing the way something moved. There are works of art that emerge swiftly, born from a burst of inspiration and shaped by a confident, unhesitating hand. And then there are works that grow slowly, layer by layer, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river. Works that require not only skill, but patience, introspection, and a willingness to let time become a collaborator. For Leonardo, the painting that would later be known as the Mona Lisa belonged unmistakably to the second category. It was less a portrait and more a quiet dialogue between artist and subject, a conversation carried out in silence over years rather than hours. And though Leonardo painted countless other works during his life, frescoes, studies, grand commissions, none absorbed him with the same persistent, enigmatic pull as the small panel he began in Florence, a panel that would follow him across cities, across decades, and eventually into legend. When Lisa Gherardini first sat for the portrait, Leonardo approached the task with his characteristic attentiveness, observing her not merely as a subject, but as a living phenomenon. He watched the way her eyes held a glimmer of curiosity, the way her lips curved not fully into a smile, but into something more subtle, an expression that seemed suspended between serenity and secrecy. To most painters, capturing her likeness would have been a matter of outlining the features, matching tones, and following the conventional methods of portraiture. But Leonardo had never been content with convention. He sought not just likeness, but presence, not just beauty, but truth. And truth, he believed, lived beneath the surface, in the faintest shadows, in the tender transitions between one expression and the next, in the subtle dance of light and perspective that shaped how a viewer perceived a face. From the first strokes, Leonardo approached the painting with a quiet intensity. He worked slowly, applying paint in thin, translucent layers, each one softening the last until the image began to glow from within. This technique, called sfumato, was not merely a style to him. It was a philosophy. Life did not exist in harsh lines or sharp boundaries. It unfolded in gradients, in imperceptible shifts, in the almost invisible blending of tones. Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa as if he were painting breath itself, delicate, elusive, constantly shaping and reshaping the contours of her face. But the painting did not progress quickly. Days passed, then weeks, and Leonardo often found himself returning to the panel only to make the smallest adjustment, a gentle refinement of the lips, a deepening of the shadows beneath the chin, a softening of the gaze. To others in the workshop, his pace bordered on agonizing. Apprentices whispered that he would never finish, that he was chasing perfection too fleeting to capture. Yet Leonardo was not chasing perfection. He was listening to the painting as it revealed itself, listening to what the expression asked for, listening to the subtle interplay between subject and artist that could not be rushed. There were long stretches when Leonardo set the painting aside entirely. Other commissions demanded his attention: engineering projects, anatomical studies, frescoes, court duties. But even when the panel rested untouched, the Mona Lisa lived in his mind. He carried her expression with him during his morning walks, seeing it reflected in the smiles of passers-by. He saw it in the curve of riverbanks, in the shadows cast by soft hills, in the luminous gradations of fog that drifted across valleys. That enigmatic smile followed him everywhere, not hauntingly, but quietly, like a question he was still learning how to understand. As the years passed, Leonardo returned to the painting again and again, refining her with each encounter. He was no longer merely depicting a Florentine woman. He was exploring the complexity of the human soul. He experimented with the way the corners of her eyes tilted upward, with the softness at the edges of her smile, with the subtle asymmetry that gave her expression life. He once wrote that the slightest shift in a facial muscle could change the entire meaning of a smile, and in the Mona Lisa, he pursued that principle with unyielding dedication. What resulted was an expression that could not be pinned down, that seemed to change with the viewer's gaze, that carried both warmth and distance in equal measure. The landscape behind her underwent transformations as well. Leonardo infused it with the same atmospheric softness he observed during his years wandering Tuscany and Lombardy. The winding paths, the distant mountains, the mist rising gently from imagined lakes, they all reflected his belief that nature too possessed moods that must be captured with care. The landscape did not frame her. It conversed with her, creating a sense of harmony between human presence and the world beyond. She appeared not simply seated before the horizon, but connected to it, shaped by the same forces of light and shadow that shaped rivers and hills. What puzzled and fascinated Leonardo most was the paradox of presence. How could a flat panel of wood hold such life? How could a portrait appear to breathe, to think, to listen? He experimented tirelessly with these questions, often adjusting details so minuscule that no one else would ever notice them. He painted not only what he saw, but what he sensed: the quiet pulse of thought behind the eyes, the warmth beneath the skin, the intangible glow of a spirit lingering just beneath the surface. But this pursuit came with its own frustrations. Leonardo often felt the painting slipping away from him, becoming something he could not fully grasp. Each improvement revealed a new imperfection. Each refinement uncovered a deeper truth he had not yet captured. The painting became a mirror for his own inner complexity, a reminder that understanding another person, truly understanding them, was perhaps as elusive as understanding nature itself. And so, he kept the Mona Lisa close, even when powerful patrons requested it. He carried it with him from Florence to Milan, from Milan to Rome, and eventually to France. He traveled with it not as a finished work, but as a companion, a puzzle, a meditation he could never set aside completely. In the quiet hours of evening, when Leonardo sat alone in his studio with the panel propped gently against a wall, he often studied it without touching a brush. He watched how the dim light shaped her expression, how the shadows deepened at dusk, how the smile softened into something almost ethereal. He wondered if he had created her, or discovered her, if he had invented her expression, or merely revealed what had been there all along. Such questions lingered with him, soothing and unsettling in equal measure. Years later, as Leonardo grew older and his hands trembled with the weight of age, he still returned to the Mona Lisa. He touched her face with small, careful adjustments, refining the light in her eyes, the softness of her skin. And when at last he reached a point where further improvement felt impossible, not because the painting was complete, but because he sensed he had travelled as far as he could, he set down his brush and simply looked. Looked with the wonder of someone who had spent a lifetime studying nature, only to discover that the human face contained mysteries deeper than any river or star. Leonardo da Vinci did not finish the Mona Lisa. He surrendered to her. He understood that some truths cannot be fully grasped, only approached. And in that gentle surrender, in that quiet battle between artist and mystery, he created not just a painting, but an echo of humanity itself, a reflection of the complexity, tenderness, and ambiguity that defines what it means to be alive. And so, the painter's silence endures, held forever in the curve of a smile. There is a certain restlessness that follows minds too full of questions, an inability to remain in one place, one medium, one idea for long. For Leonardo, this restlessness was not a flaw, but a natural consequence of the way he existed in the world. His curiosity did not move in straight lines. It spiraled, expanded, wove itself into every direction at once. And so, throughout his life, he gathered projects the way others gathered possessions, sketches of inventions, outlines of treatises, half-finished paintings, engineering proposals, anatomical notes, architectural fantasies. Each project began with the same spark of wonder, the same promise of revelation, and then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, Leonardo's attention shifted, drawn away by some new pattern, some new mystery that seemed, in that moment, more urgent than anything he had pursued before. To many, this habit of leaving work unfinished seemed like indecision or lack of discipline. But for Leonardo, it was simply the nature of a mind that saw too much beauty in the world to settle for a single pursuit. He approached each new project with an almost childlike enthusiasm. When an idea struck him, whether a mechanical invention, a philosophical question, or a commission from a nobleman, he threw himself into it with tenderness and precision. For days, sometimes weeks, he worked tirelessly, making rapid progress that astonished those around him. He would sketch prototypes, improvise small models, gather notes into carefully organized lists. He would wander the streets or countryside in search of materials, studying how different shapes and forces behaved under pressure. His mind moved with the intensity of a river after heavy rain, fast, deep, unpredictable. And then, suddenly, the current would shift. A new idea would appear on the horizon, glimmering with promise, and Leonardo would follow it without hesitation, leaving the previous one unfinished. The notebooks he carried everywhere, bound in leather, filled with pages worn by use, became the quiet graveyards of his abandoned projects. But they were not graves in the ordinary sense. They were places where ideas rested, waiting for a moment when Leonardo might return to them. The pages overflowed with diagrams for machines never built, massive crossbows longer than a room, underwater breathing apparatus inspired by fish gills, rotating bridges designed to fold like wings, multi-barreled cannons intended to revolutionize warfare. Many of these inventions were centuries ahead of their time, too ambitious for the materials and knowledge of his era. Yet Leonardo drew them as if they could emerge tomorrow, as if imagination alone could pull the future into the present. And then there were the artworks, paintings begun with great ceremony, then quietly set aside. The Adoration of the Magi, commissioned by the monks of San Donato, became a masterpiece of potential. Swirling figures, intricate architecture, expressions captured in mid-thought. Leonardo poured his observations into it, layering narrative and symbolism until the painting seemed alive with movement. But before it reached completion, he left Florence for Milan, drawn by new opportunities and new ambitions. The painting remained unfinished, a frozen moment of brilliance that scholars would admire for centuries, but that the monks never received. To Leonardo, the abandonment was not betrayal, it was evolution. He followed where his mind led, even when it meant leaving behind something extraordinary. Some collaborators found this maddening. Patrons whispered that he was unreliable, too easily distracted, too much a dreamer. They wanted certainty. Deadlines met, commissions delivered, engineering plans executed without delay. But Leonardo was not a craftsman working toward a single goal. He was a philosopher whose medium happened to be everything he touched. He often told patrons he needed more time, not because he sought comfort or idleness, but because the very act of working revealed new possibilities. A painting, once begun, presented 20 directions to expand. An invention, once designed, revealed a dozen hidden problems that fascinated him more than the invention itself. Leonardo did not want to finish quickly. He wanted to understand. There were periods when he approached completion, when a painting seemed within a day's work, or an invention seemed only a few tests away from realization. But these moments rarely brought satisfaction. Instead, they awakened a deeper unrest in him, the feeling that the idea, in being completed, would lose its mystery, would no longer offer the thrill of unfolding. Leonardo found joy in the process, not the conclusion. To finish was to close a door, and closing doors felt unnatural to someone whose mind lived in open spaces. Even his writings reflected this pattern. He began treatises on painting, on anatomy, on water movement, on flight, on mechanics, on the nature of the human soul, each one containing insights of astonishing depth. But none were fully polished into completion. The pages drifted between theory and observation, between sketches and reflections, between lists and diagrams. They were living documents, not linear works. And in that, they mirrored Leonardo's own way of thinking, fluid, expansive, evolving endlessly. Yet this incompleteness was not a sign of failure. It was, paradoxically, part of Leonardo's genius. Because he left so much unfinished, his mind remained perpetually open, open to revision, to discovery, to possibility. He never confined himself to one discipline long enough to become rigid or inflexible. He remained, always, a student of the world. His unfinished works became bridges rather than endpoints, bridges that led other thinkers, artists, and inventors into places they might never have ventured without his guidance. In this sense, Leonardo did not leave fragments. He left invitations. Still, there were quiet moments when he questioned himself. Alone in his workshop, surrounded by half-built models and panels bearing only the first layers of paint, he sometimes wondered whether he ought to discipline his mind, whether he should try to focus more narrowly. But whenever he attempted such discipline, he felt his spirit constrict. He could no more restrict his curiosity than he could stop the movement of water. So he made peace with his nature. He worked in spirals, not lines. He chased questions, not answers, and he allowed himself to return to ideas long after others might have abandoned them forever. In the end, the world remembers Leonardo not for what he finished, but for what he saw, for the vast landscape of possibility his mind inhabited, for the questions he asked before humanity knew how to answer them, for the fragments that continue to spark invention centuries later. His unfinished projects stand not as evidence of distraction, but as monuments to imagination, a reminder that greatness is not always measured in completion, but in vision. And perhaps that was Leonardo's quiet truth, that a life devoted to understanding cannot be neatly concluded, cannot be checked off like a completed task. It flows, expands, circles back upon itself. It leaves threads unknotted, ideas half expressed, works half formed. Because understanding is infinite, and Leonardo, more than anyone, knew that he was merely passing through, touching mysteries, illuminating possibilities, and leaving behind a trail of beginnings for others to follow. His mind was never interrupted by failure. It was interrupted only by wonder. Milan welcomed Leonardo not with the gentle familiarity of Florence, but with a weightier rhythm, one shaped by ambition, rivalry, and the constant hum of political tension that threaded through the courts of the powerful. Where Florence breathed art as naturally as air, Milan exhaled strategy and authority. Its towers rose sharper, its streets bustled with merchants from distant lands, its workshops echoed with metal rather than paint, and its grand fortress castles cast long shadows over the city's narrow alleys. This was not the vibrant cradle of the Renaissance that Leonardo had grown up in. This was a place where ideas served power, where invention was currency, and where the patron he sought, Ludovico Sforza, called Il Moro, ruled with both charm and calculation. And yet, despite the shadows that lingered in Milan, Leonardo felt something stir within him as he arrived. A quiet anticipation that this city, with all its contrasts, might give him room to dream on a scale Florence had never allowed. He came to Milan with a letter, half resume, half declaration, offering his services not primarily as a painter, but as an engineer, a designer of weapons, a maker of machines capable of defending and elevating the duchy. It was a bold reintroduction of himself, a reminder of the versatility that had always shaped him. Leonardo sensed that in Milan, art alone might not secure a place at court, but ingenuity might. And so, he described siege machines, armored vehicles, canal systems, and bridges with a confidence fueled by imagination rather than practical testing. The letter did not exaggerate his abilities. It merely reflected a truth others had yet to recognize, that Leonardo's mind could exceed the boundaries of tradition. Ludovico Sforza, intrigued by the audacity and breadth of the proposal, welcomed him into his service. The court of Milan was dazzling in its own way. Nobles moved through ornate halls draped in tapestries, music drifted beneath high vaulted ceilings, and conversations bloomed in polished tones meant to impress more than communicate. Leonardo, dressed in simple garments compared to the nobility, moved quietly among them, observing with the same attentiveness he applied to rivers, birds, or machines. He noticed how people gestured as they spoke, how power shifted in a room with a single smile, how alliances formed in whispers. Milan was a stage, and every person performed. But Leonardo did not wish to perform. He wished to create. And Ludovico gave him space, sometimes reluctantly, often unpredictably, to do just that. His tasks in Milan were vast and varied. One day he designed sets for court festivals, crafting elaborate decorations and theatrical illusions that transformed evenings into dreams of mechanical wonder. Another day he planned canals and drainage systems, studying how water carved its path through the landscape and imagining ways to tame its power. He sculpted models for massive equestrian statues, spent entire days experimenting with metallurgy, and sketched ideas for machines meant to defend the city from invasion. In quiet rooms lit by oil lamps, he tinkered with mechanical devices, building prototypes with gears that whirred softly in the darkness. Milan, with its appetite for innovation, became a canvas for the engineering side of his mind, a place where he could let imagination bloom without apology. But it was not only machinery that filled his days. Milan introduced him to the complexities of court life, to the expectations of patrons who were as demanding as they were generous. Ludovico Sforza admired Leonardo's brilliance, but struggled with his slowness, with his tendency to lose himself in details, with his inability to finish quickly what others expected sooner. Leonardo found himself once again caught between curiosity and obligation. Some projects flourished, others faded beneath the weight of new ideas. Yet Ludovico, perhaps sensing that genius could not be forced into the rigid timelines of court politics, tolerated this unpredictability, at least for a time. And then there were the shadows. Milan was not merely a place of opportunity, it was a city woven with quiet dangers. Political alliances shifted like sand beneath a river. Rival families watched each other with distrust. Every festival that glittered with color hid tensions behind its music. Leonardo felt these undercurrents, even if he did not speak of them. He saw how fragile Ludovico's power could be, how quickly admiration could turn into suspicion, how heavily a city's future rested on decisions made in secret chambers. It was perhaps this awareness that made Leonardo cautious, reflective, more attuned to the precariousness of human ambition. Yet, despite the heaviness that sometimes pressed upon him, Leonardo found moments of profound inspiration in Milan. Its architecture, grand, geometric, imposing, fed his fascination with structure. Its wide streets offered new perspectives for studying light and shadow. Its people, dressed in silks and velvets, moving with the confidence of the wealthy, gave him new expressions to capture, new gestures to study. And in quiet hours, alone in his quarters, Leonardo worked on sketches that would one day lead to some of his most refined paintings, including The Last Supper. He studied the human face with renewed intensity, searching for the emotional truths that lingered beneath expressions shaped by power and politics. His evenings were often spent in contemplation. He would walk along the canals, watching how torchlight reflected off the water in trembling ripples. He would study the texture of stone bridges, the flow of wind through narrow passageways, the quiet glow of lanterns in distant windows. Milan, for all its noise and complexity, offered him pockets of solitude where thought deepened. And in those moments, Leonardo sensed that the city was shaping him in ways Florence never had, not by nurturing him with beauty, but by challenging him with contradiction. Over time, Milan became both a workshop and a mirror. It reflected the restlessness within him, the longing for discovery, the tension between duty and curiosity. It revealed the strength of his imagination and the fragility of human ambition. It pushed him into new territories, mechanical, architectural, expressive, territories he might never have explored, had he stayed in the gentler embrace of Florence. And though Milan's shadows would one day grow darker, though political storms would eventually sweep through its streets and halls, Leonardo carried from this period not fear but understanding. Understanding of power, of change, of the unpredictable rhythm of life. Understanding that the world was not made solely of beauty, but of conflict, of struggle, of unfinished dreams. And in those contrasts, Leonardo found a deeper truth. That creation often arises not from harmony, but from tension, not from ease, but from complexity. Milan did not simply give Leonardo opportunity, it gave him depth. There are moments in history that feel impossibly large for the canvas meant to hold them, moments so heavy with meaning that any attempt to capture them risks shrinking what cannot be contained. When Leonardo was asked to paint the Last Supper on the refectory wall of Santa Maria delle Grazie, he understood immediately that this was not a simple commission. It was not merely the depiction of a biblical episode, nor a task assigned for decoration. It was an invitation to freeze the most charged instant in the Christian story, the moment Jesus announces that one of his disciples will betray him, an instant where every face, every gesture, every breath is wound tight with shock, grief, disbelief, anger, and confusion. To illustrate such an explosion of emotion on a silent wall required not only technical mastery, but a profound understanding of humanity, of how thought moves beneath the skin, of how a single sentence can fracture a room. Leonardo approached the task slowly, not because he doubted himself, but because he wanted to understand the moment as deeply as possible. He spent days sitting in the refectory, staring at the blank wall, listening to the echoes of monks at prayer, as if their footsteps might whisper something about the gravity of the scene. He imagined the long table, the bread, the wine, the flickering lamplight, the dust clinging to the disciples' sandals. He imagined their voices just before the revelation, the warmth of fellowship, the comfort of routine. And then he imagined that sudden silence, that breath between the spoken words and their comprehension. Leonardo believed that the Last Supper was not the story of betrayal, but the story of human reaction to the idea of betrayal. And so his painting would not revolve around Judas alone, but around the shockwave that moved outward through the group, changing each face in its own way. He studied men throughout Milan, merchants in conversation, soldiers arguing in taverns, beggars asking for alms, nobles debating strategy in the ducal court. Leonardo observed their hands, their brows, their shoulders, the way emotion traveled through the body before it reached the mouth. Sometimes he stopped strangers on the street, asking them to hold an expression while he sketched rapidly in his notebook. Some found him eccentric, others flattered, but all felt his attention like a weight, as though he was seeing something they did not know how to show deliberately. These studies became the foundation for the apostles' gestures, Peter's indignation, John's quiet sorrow, Thomas's restless suspicion, Philip's plea for reassurance. Leonardo refused to treat any figure as symbolic or predetermined. Each apostle became a psychological portrait, shaped not by doctrine, but by human truth. He wanted them to feel alive, not wholly in the abstract, but deeply human, flawed, emotional, startled into recognition of their own frailty. Even Judas, who countless artists had reduced to caricature, Leonardo painted with nuance. He placed Judas in the shadow, yes, but not isolated. He kept him among the others, his body leaning backward in instinctive recoil, his hand gripping the small bag of silver, almost without thought, his face a mixture of guilt, and defiance. Leonardo believed that villains did not identify themselves as such, and so Judas appears not monstrous, but painfully real, a man caught between his decision and its consequences. The technical challenges of the painting were equally daunting. Fresco required swift, decisive strokes on wet plaster, a method Leonardo found too restrictive for the subtle layers and soft transitions he envisioned. And so, against convention, he experimented with a new technique, mixing tempera and oil on a dry wall, applying layer after delicate layer to achieve a depth frescoes could not allow. It was a risk, one that would later threaten the painting's longevity, but Leonardo's mind was consumed not with durability, but with immediacy, with the need to create something that felt alive the moment it was completed. For months, he worked in silence, often for only a few hours a day, sometimes not at all. The monks grew frustrated. They expected progress, steady labor, predictable work. But Leonardo did not paint by schedule. He painted when the idea had ripened enough to emerge. He might spend an entire afternoon staring at Peter's hand or Judas's shoulder, waiting for the precise angle of tension to reveal itself. At times, he climbed the scaffolding at dawn, added a single stroke of color, then descended without touching the wall again for days. But when he did paint, his energy was electric. Witnesses wrote that he moved with intensity, with a concentration so complete it seemed to silence the room around him. He painted faces that looked as though they had just turned toward the viewer, hands that had just risen in protest, bodies caught in the exact moment before motion fully expressed itself. And then came the figure of Christ, quiet, still, composed, placed at the center not only of the composition, but of the storm itself. Leonardo softened his features, not with divinity, but with profound human sorrow. Christ does not accuse, he accepts. His hands extend gently, palms open, as though offering peace even in the moment of rupture. The perspective lines draw toward him, making the entire room converge upon his stillness. Leonardo created Christ not as an unreachable symbol, but as a man who understood the hearts of those around him, who loved them despite their failures, who saw their confusion and fear not as faults, but as the fragile truths of being human. When the painting neared completion, rumors spread across Milan. People whispered that Leonardo had done something unprecedented, that the walls seemed to breathe with life. And when it was finally unveiled, the reaction was not loud admiration, but stunned silence. Onlookers felt they were standing in the room of the Last Supper itself, witnessing not a frozen biblical narrative, but an intimate moment, alive, trembling, unfolding. They felt the weight of Jesus' words, the shock of the disciples, the tension hanging in the air like a trembling thread. And yet, Leonardo himself did not celebrate. He stood quietly in the refectory long after others had left, studying the painting the way he studied a river or a sunset. He knew its flaws, its fragility. He knew his experimental technique might not endure. But he also recognized that he had touched something rare, a moment that kept moving even though the paint was still, a scene that felt alive in every gesture, every shadow, every breath suggested, but never painted. The Last Supper was not simply a masterpiece. It was a captured heartbeat, one that continues to echo through time. There are quests that cannot be pursued in daylight, quests that require a different kind of silence, one that presses against the skin like cold breath, one that hangs in the corners of a room where no one else dares to linger. For Leonardo, The study of anatomy belonged to this nocturnal world, a world where curiosity brushed against taboo, and the search for truth demanded that he cross thresholds most men avoided. In Milan, and later in Florence and Rome, Leonardo began one of the most extraordinary and unsettling chapters of his life. He entered the realm of the dead in order to understand the living. While others saw the human body as a vessel of mystery sealed by fear or superstition, Leonardo saw it as the most intricate machine the universe had crafted, a system of pulleys, rivers, chambers, hinges, and astonishing design. And because he believed that speculation without observation was nothing but a polite form of ignorance, he sought permission to study human corpses, slipping quietly into hospitals and morgues at night, carrying nothing but paper, chalk, and the unshakable conviction that truth was worth confronting darkness. Those nights were unlike anything else in his life. The world of courts and workshops and commissions faded behind him as he walked through narrow streets lit only by the occasional lantern. The air smelled of smoke and damp stone. Doors creaked open reluctantly to let him enter the dim chambers of hospitals, where silence was thick with the weight of recent suffering. Leonardo worked alone, sometimes with a single candle, sometimes with none at all, when he wanted to watch how shadows revealed the body's contours. The bodies lay before him on wooden tables, cool and motionless, and yet in his eyes they were not symbols of death, but maps of life, maps waiting to be read. He began with the familiar, muscles he had seen on living models, the structure of the hand he had drawn countless times. But the deeper he went, peeling back layers of skin, tracing tendons with gentle fingers, cutting into the chambers of the heart, the more he realized how little anyone truly understood. He described the structure of bones with the precision of an architect, noting how each curve and ridge served a specific function. He studied the way muscles overlapped and interlocked, like ropes woven into an elegant, purposeful design. He traced nerves like rivers branching through a landscape, and when he reached the heart, he lingered, mesmerized by the valves, their elegant folds, their rhythmic logic, their simplicity and complexity woven together. Centuries before medical science would confirm it, Leonardo understood that the heart was not a furnace of emotions, but a mechanical pump, a masterpiece of engineering. His drawings from these nights are among the most astonishing works humanity has ever produced. They are not clinical, they are reverent. Every line breathes with awe, every annotation with gratitude. Leonardo did not flinch from the realities of dissection. He embraced them with a quiet tenderness, as if he believed that honoring the dead meant learning from them with sincerity and care. He drew spinal columns with the elegance of architectural sketches. He mapped the human skull as if charting a hidden fortress. He examined the arteries of old men, the developing bodies of fetuses, the musculature of the neck, the motion of the jaw. He wrote long passages beside his drawings, describing what he saw with calm precision, always aware that he was approaching forbidden knowledge that could unsettle the comfortable assumptions of his century. And yet, he did not do this work for fame. He did it because he believed that understanding the body was essential for understanding everything else. Movement, expression, proportion, pain, aging, emotion. The human face, for Leonardo, could not be painted truthfully without knowing the muscles beneath the skin. A gesture could not be rendered convincingly without understanding the joints that guided it. A figure could not seem alive unless the artist understood how life itself was structured. And so, these nocturnal studies fed not only his scientific inquiries, but his artistic soul. The softness of the Mona Lisa's hands, the tension in Christ's neck at the Last Supper, the swirling forms of his battle scenes, all were shaped by what Leonardo learned among the dead. But the work was not without cost. He sometimes emerged from these chambers exhausted, chilled to the bone, carrying on his clothes the faint, unmistakable scent of decay. He wrote of how the sight of death weighed upon him, how certain dissections brought him face to face with the fragility of his own existence. There were nights when he paused, scalpel in hand, struck by the realization that the bodies before him had once been vibrant, breathing people with hopes, fears, and memories. And yet, he continued, driven not by morbid curiosity, but by a profound respect for the structures that made human life possible. His contemporaries could not fathom the purpose of such work. Medicine at the time relied heavily on ancient texts, many of which were inaccurate or incomplete. Doctors followed tradition rather than observation. Leonardo broke from this entirely. He trusted his eyes above all else. He believed that truth was not something handed down through books, but something uncovered through careful, patient study. In this, he became not merely an artist of anatomy, but a philosopher of it. His notebooks from this period grew thick with discoveries. Over 700 detailed anatomical drawings, accompanied by meticulous explanations. Had they been published, they would have changed the course of medical history centuries earlier. But Leonardo was cautious, perhaps too aware of how radical his findings were, perhaps worried that they would be misunderstood. And so the notebooks remained with him, private treasures of insight that the world would not fully appreciate until long after his death. Still, he found solace in the work itself. In those dim rooms, surrounded by stillness, Leonardo felt connected to something larger than art, larger than science. He felt that he was touching the intimate architecture of life, revealing secrets nature had encoded in silence. And though the world outside did not yet understand the magnitude of his discoveries, Leonardo knew that he had entered a realm where observation approached reverence. The secret nights among the dead shaped his understanding of the living more profoundly than any commission or patron ever could. They taught him that beauty lay in structure, that nature's design was elegant beyond measure, that even the smallest bone carried purpose. And they revealed a truth Leonardo carried quietly for the rest of his life, that to know the human body was to know the universe itself, folded inward. There are childhood dreams that fade as a person grows older, dreams that dissolve into practicality and the rhythms of adult life. But for Leonardo, the dream of flight was not something he outgrew. It matured with him, deepened, transformed into a lifelong study of movement, possibility, and the quiet laws of nature that reveal themselves only to those who watch with devotion. From the time he was a boy in Vinci, staring at the slow arcs of kites and hawks drifting across Tuscan skies, Leonardo felt a stirring within him, a recognition that flight was not magic, but a language written in wind and wings. And throughout his life, long after he became one of the most celebrated artists in Italy, that early fascination remained one of the purest expressions of his curiosity. The world walked with their eyes on the ground. Leonardo looked upward, searching the heavens for clues. He spent countless hours outdoors, leaning against stone walls or sitting in the grass, simply watching birds. Most people observed flight only long enough to appreciate its beauty, but Leonardo observed to understand. He watched how birds angled their wings into the wind, how they pivoted without losing balance, how their feathers spread or tightened depending on the speed of their ascent. He sketched these movements tirelessly, often filling entire pages with variations of wings in motion. His notes beside them were as intense as his anatomical studies. Detailed descriptions of air currents, speculations about the relationship between wing shape and lift, attempts to calculate the force needed to sustain a human body in the air. He did not merely watch flight, he studied its soul. In the evenings, he would return to his workshop and attempt to translate what he had witnessed into mechanical form. He built models with wooden frames, stretched cloth across lattices, experimented with different shapes of wings, some modelled after bats, others after birds of prey. His early designs imitated the flapping motion of living wings, with pulleys and levers meant to be operated by a human pilot. Leonardo believed that if he could decode nature thoroughly enough, he could recreate its miracles. And though the materials of his time, wood, iron, cloth, limited what could be built, he refused to accept that limitation as a final barrier. For him, failure was not an argument against the dream. It was evidence that he had not yet understood something essential. He approached the dream of flight with the same spirit of reverence that guided his anatomical studies. To him, flight was not simply a mechanical challenge. It was a profound expression of freedom, of perspective, of transcendence. He imagined how the world would look from above, how rivers curved like silver threads, how valleys opened like gentle bowls, how cities seemed to breathe through their networks of streets. He wrote in one of his notebooks that a person who had seen flight would forever walk differently, as though aware that the ground beneath him was only one dimension of experience. And Leonardo longed to see the world through that elevated lens, to understand how distance softened edges, how light changed when viewed from above, how the sky could become a road for those bold enough to follow its call. Sometimes, late at night, he climbed hills outside whatever city he happened to be living in, Florence, Milan, or Rome, and launched small gliders into the wind. These simple devices, fragile as the wings of paper birds, revealed truths that diagrams alone could not. Leonardo watched how they rose, dipped, spun, or glided smoothly depending on their shape. He adjusted them, trimming edges, altering weight distribution, experimenting with the placement of strings or rudders. These small tests were his dialogue with the sky, each attempt a question, each flight a whispered answer. But the deeper he went into his studies, the more he understood that human-powered flapping flight, the dream most people imagined, was nearly impossible with the strength of a human body. Birds possessed muscles uniquely suited for flight, hollow bones to reduce weight, bodies built by evolutionary pressures no machine could easily replicate. Leonardo noted this with a mixture of disappointment and respect. He realized that if humans were ever to fly, they needed to model their machines not simply on the appearance of wings, but on the principles behind them, the way air flowed, the way lift was generated, the way balance was maintained. This shift in understanding marked a turning point in his research. From this came one of his most astonishing insights, that flight might rely not on flapping, but on gliding, on manipulating surfaces to generate lift and stability. His later designs, parachutes, adjustable wings, controlled gliders, hinted at technologies that would not emerge until centuries later. He sketched a parachute shaped like a pyramid, writing confidently that a man could descend safely from great heights if such a device were built properly. He designed wings that could tilt for steering, foreshadowing aeronautical controls. He imagined mechanisms that would allow a person to rise, turn, and land with grace, not by brute force, but by the cooperation between human intention and natural law. These were not fantasies. They were predictions. Yet Leonardo's dream of flight was more than a scientific pursuit. It was deeply personal. In quiet moments, he wrote about how the sky represented purity, clarity, and the highest form of perspective. He believed that to rise above the earth was to escape, even momentarily, the pettiness of human conflict, the weight of politics, the fragility of ambition. He saw in flight a metaphor for thought itself, how ideas rise, drift, and settle. He even confessed in one rare, vulnerable note that when he watched birds, he envied them, not their bodies, but their ability to move through the world without obstruction, guided by nothing but instinct and the soft geometry of air. But despite all his brilliance, despite the elegance of his drawings, Leonardo never achieved flight in his lifetime. His machines remained proposals, experiments, poetic gestures toward a future only he could imagine. Some historians later claimed this as failure, but Leonardo never saw it that way. To him, the act of imagining was already a victory, because imagination carved paths where none existed before. He believed that humanity would eventually learn to fly, not because of his specific inventions, but because he had shown that the problem was solvable, that nature's laws could be decoded, that dreams were merely the future seen early. And he was right. Centuries after his death, engineers and aviators would look back at his notebooks and marvel at how closely his sketches resembled modern gliders, parachutes, and control systems. They would recognize in his studies the foundations of aerodynamics, the seeds of the machines that would one day cross oceans and pierce the clouds. Leonardo da Vinci never flew, but he gave humanity the wings it would later learn to build. Water had always spoken to Leonardo with a voice more honest than any human language. He believed that to understand a river, its currents, its eddies, its stubborn insistence on carving its own path, was to understand motion itself. And so, as he grew older and his responsibilities in Milan expanded, Leonardo began to dream not only of machines and paintings and flight, but of cities transformed by the gentle, disciplined power of water. To most men, a canal was a mere channel, a convenient route for transporting goods. To Leonardo, a canal was a vein, a structure that carried life through the body of a city, shaping its growth, feeding its people, protecting its homes. It was a system of balance, a living architecture that, if designed thoughtfully, could elevate humanity itself. His fascination with water had deep roots. As a boy in Vinci, he had watched streams twist through the hills, carving patterns in the earth with a patience no human hand could match. In Florence, he had marveled at the Arno River, its moods, its floods, its shimmering calm, and imagined ways to redirect, control, and harness its power. By the time he arrived in Milan, this fascination had matured into a profound understanding of hydraulics, one so intuitive that even modern engineers marvel at the precision of his notes. Leonardo saw water not as an element, but as a dynamic system governed by principles that could be studied, predicted, and guided. Milan, with its flat plains and complex waterways, provided the perfect canvas for these ideas. The city relied heavily on its network of canals, the navigli, for transportation, irrigation, and defense. But these canals were crude, often stagnant, vulnerable to flooding and structural collapse. Leonardo saw their potential immediately, imagining a system where water flowed with purpose, where locks controlled levels with ease, where boats glided from one elevation to another with minimal effort. The city, he believed, could become a living organism, powered not by brute force, but by the elegance of engineered flow. He began by redesigning the locks themselves. Traditional locks were inefficient, requiring excessive manual labor and prone to failure. Leonardo's solution was simple yet revolutionary. He invented the mitre lock, a design that used angled gates capable of sealing themselves more tightly under pressure. This meant that water could be controlled with far greater precision, and the movement of boats through the canals became smoother, safer, and faster. His sketches reveal not only the mechanism, but also the principles: pressure, buoyancy, force distribution, written in mirror script beside delicate diagrams. Modern locks still use this principle, a quiet testament to the mind that first imagined it centuries ago. But Leonardo's ambitions reached far beyond mechanical improvements. He dreamed of reshaping Milan into a city defined by harmony, clean, efficient, beautiful, and free from the disease that plagued its crowded quarters. His vision included 2 layers of streets: an upper level for pedestrians, illuminated by sunlight and lined with elegant buildings, and a lower level for canals, where goods could be transported silently beneath the city. Waste, instead of accumulating in alleyways, would be washed away through carefully designed flows. Traffic, instead of snarling through narrow passages, would be distributed across a rational grid. In Leonardo's mind, water was not merely a tool, but a guiding principle for urban life, capable of bringing order to chaos. He presented some of these ideas to Ludovico Sforza, who admired Leonardo's imagination, but saw such sweeping plans as impractical, if not impossible. Massive reconstruction of the city was too costly, too disruptive, too visionary for the politics of the time. But Leonardo was undeterred. Even if the full city could not be built, parts of it could live. Improved locks, smarter waterways, better drainage systems. And so he poured himself into refining what could be achieved within the confines of reality, even as he allowed himself to dream tirelessly in the pages of his notebooks. His studies of water deepened during this period. He spent long hours by the banks of rivers, observing how currents shifted around obstacles, how waves collided and merged, how droplets split and rejoined. He sketched whirlpools with the precision of a physicist, studied erosion as if it were a sculptor's tool, wrote about the mathematics of flow decades before fluid dynamics became a field of study. Water, to him, was the purest expression of motion, predictable in its laws, yet infinite in its forms. He once wrote that water was the driving force of all nature, and he meant it not as poetry, but as a scientific truth. Yet there was poetry in it too. Leonardo felt a deep emotional connection to water, a sense that its ceaseless movement mirrored the restlessness of his own mind. Just as rivers carved new paths when obstructed, Leonardo shifted effortlessly between disciplines when one avenue seemed blocked. Just as water reflected the world above it with quiet honesty, Leonardo's notebooks reflected the world around him with clarity unmatched in his century. The more he studied water, the more he understood himself. He applied this understanding not only to canals, but to architecture. In his designs for buildings, he often incorporated water features, fountains powered by hidden mechanisms, cisterns designed to collect rain efficiently, ventilation systems inspired by the flow of currents. Even his military engineering drew from hydraulic principles. Forts shaped to redirect the path of projectiles, moats designed to maintain stable levels regardless of weather. Everywhere Leonardo looked, water offered answers. But perhaps the most personal of his water-related projects was his plan to reroute the Arno River. This was a project that Leonardo revived multiple times throughout his life, proposing a redirection of the river to both prevent flooding and provide Florence with a navigable route to the sea. It was ambitious, controversial, and ultimately unrealized, yet it reveals how deeply he believed in the transformative power of controlled water. Had it been completed, it would have changed the fate of Tuscany itself. In the final years of his Milanese period, Leonardo often revisited his canal projects as a kind of refuge. When court politics grew tense, when patrons became unreliable, when war threatened the city's stability, he returned to the quiet certainty of water, to the sketches that flowed effortlessly from his pen, to the calculations that soothed his restless thoughts. While paintings required inspiration and patrons demanded deadlines, water offered stability. It asked nothing of him except attention, and Leonardo gave it willingly. Looking back centuries later, it is clear that Leonardo's dream of a perfect city was not merely architectural, but philosophical. He wanted a world where human life flowed with the same grace as a river unobstructed, where systems worked because they were guided by natural principles, where beauty and function were two sides of the same truth. His designs were never built in full, but their spirit survives in modern urban planning, in hydraulic engineering, in the countless ways humanity has learned to coexist with water rather than fight against it. Leonardo da Vinci did not live to see his perfect city rise, but in imagining it, he helped shape the cities we inhabit today. There were days when Leonardo seemed less like an artist or inventor and more like a man attempting to decipher a code woven into the fabric of the world. He believed that nature spoke in patterns, and that those patterns, if observed with enough patience, could reveal truths deeper than any philosophical argument or scholarly text. As he moved through the landscapes of Milan, Florence, and later Rome, Leonardo became obsessed not only with machines and human bodies, but with the sky itself, with clouds that gathered like soft mountains, with light that stretched across valleys in faint golden ribbons, with rainstorms that rose and broke with a kind of mathematical rhythm. To most people, weather was merely a matter of inconvenience or routine. To Leonardo, it was an expression of nature's hidden geometry, a vast network of forces interacting with elegance that begged to be understood. And so, he began one of the most unusual chapters of his study, a quiet attempt to map the sky. His fascination began with light. During his early years as a painter, Leonardo had already sensed that light was not a simple phenomenon, but a dynamic system that shaped everything the eye could perceive. He studied how sunlight interacted with surfaces, how shadows softened as distance increased, how reflections formed on water or polished metal, how atmospheric haze made distant mountains fade into blueness. The more he observed, the more he became convinced that light followed laws that could be measured, predicted, articulated with precision. In his notebooks, he wrote lengthy passages about the angle of the sun at various hours, about the way particles in the air scatter light, about the reason distant objects appear paler and bluer than those nearby. He understood, centuries before modern science, that color and clarity were functions of atmospheric depth. His landscapes, soft, subtle, suffused with a kind of living mist, reflected this understanding not as stylistic flourishes, but as scientific truths disguised as art. From light, Leonardo's curiosity drifted upward into the movement of clouds. He would stand for long stretches observing their formation, their transformation, their dissolution. He documented the shapes of clouds with the same care he gave to anatomical drawings, marveling at how they twisted into spirals or spread into sheets, how they signaled approaching storms or foretold calmness. Leonardo believed that clouds were not random masses, but structures shaped by invisible currents of air, and he set about sketching diagrams of airflows, drafting cross-sections of the sky as though it were a machine. He compared cloud trails to the wake patterns left by boats, speculating that the same principles governed both. He described how warm air rising from valleys collided with cooler layers above, creating turbulence and motion. He even attempted, with astonishing boldness, to predict weather based on these observations. His notes contained forecasts written in careful script, suggesting that he viewed the sky not as chaos, but as a system whose logic could be unveiled. Storms fascinated him most of all. Leonardo often walked out into the countryside when the sky darkened, eager to witness the spectacle of nature preparing for violence. He sketched storm clouds gathering like colossal arches, documenting how lightning branched across the sky, how rain seemed to fall in curtains that shifted with the wind. He described thunder as a mechanical event, the rapid expansion of air heated by lightning, and illustrated the sequence of shock waves that followed. These ideas pushed against the limits of his era, which tended to explain such phenomena through superstition or divine intervention. But Leonardo refused to accept explanations that ignored observation. He trusted his eyes, his instinct for patterns, and the belief that nature never acted without reason. His study of air and water began to merge at this point into a unified theory of motion. Leonardo saw in the swirling of clouds the same spirals he saw in eddies of rivers, in curls of hair, in the musculature of animals. He believed that vortices governed movement at every scale, that the universe favored curves over straight lines, that flow was the essential principle shaping both matter and life. The sketches he made during this period, spirals, whirlpools, wave patterns, appear almost abstract to the modern eye, but they were the early steps toward understanding fluid dynamics. He drew them not as symbols, but as mechanisms, studying how forces distributed themselves through space. His attention to detail was extraordinary. He documented how dust rose in spirals behind running horses, how smoke curled upward in tightening loops, how gusts of wind sculpted dunes of sand. Each observation strengthened his conviction that nature was fundamentally cohesive. It was during this time that Leonardo also deepened his interest in the geometry of landscapes. He studied rock formations with the intensity of a sculptor, noting the layering of sediment, the fracture lines, the erosion patterns left by ancient water. He climbed hills and examined cliffs, sketching cross-sections that anticipated geological maps. He proposed theories about fossils, arguing with quiet confidence that seas had once covered mountains, leaving behind shells that embedded themselves in stone. Such claims were radical for his era, challenging long-accepted narratives about creation. Yet Leonardo presented them not with defiance, but with calm certainty born from observation. The land, he believed, carried memories in its structure, and those memories could be read through careful study. All of this, the light, the clouds, the storms, the rocks, converged into a single desire: to understand nature as an interconnected system. Leonardo did not view different disciplines as separate fields, but as threads of one tapestry. The behavior of water informed the behavior of air. The structure of rocks informed the structure of the human body. The scattering of light informed the illusions of perspective. He believed that to master any aspect of the world, one needed to understand its coherence. And so, he built his knowledge like a vast cathedral, each observation a stone placed precisely, each question a beam supporting the next insight. In quiet moments, Leonardo imagined writing a grand treatise that would explain everything he had observed: the laws of light, the mechanics of storms, the flow of rivers, the structure of earth, the movement of air, the geometry of life. He envisioned a book that would begin with first principles and unfold into a sweeping explanation of the natural world, each chapter connected by logic and beauty. But the scope of his vision was so immense, the knowledge required so vast, that the project remained forever unfinished. His notes, scattered across hundreds of pages, reveal glimpses of what such a work might have been: a synthesis of science, art, philosophy, and curiosity, unlike anything his contemporaries could imagine. Leonardo's fascination with weather, light, and the geometry of nature was not a distraction from his art or inventions. It was the foundation of them. His paintings glowed with atmospheric truth because he understood the physics of illumination. His inventions echoed natural forms because he recognized the efficiency of nature's designs. His perspective on life itself deepened because he saw the world not as chaos, but as structure, not as a collection of isolated phenomena, but as a single, breathing organism shaped by patterns he spent a lifetime trying to unveil. And so, standing on hillsides beneath shifting skies, or leaning over rivers to watch the dance of currents, or studying stones shaped by unseen forces, Leonardo reached toward something vast, not with the arrogance of someone seeking mastery, but with the humility of someone seeking understanding. His gaze was steady, his curiosity endless, and his devotion to observation unwavering, for he believed that the language of nature was not meant to be conquered, but patiently, lovingly read. When Leonardo arrived in Rome, he did so with the weight of years pressing gently upon him, not crushing, but noticeable, like the slow settling of dust on an old manuscript. Rome was not Milan, with its restless ambition, nor Florence, with its youthful brilliance. It was an ancient organism, alive in a different way. The city breathed through ruins, whispered through crumbling arches, and carried in its stones the layered memories of empires that had risen and fallen long before Leonardo's birth. It should have been the perfect place for a mind devoted to the secrets of nature and the mysteries of structure. Yet Rome offered him something unexpected, a strange mixture of opportunity and isolation, inspiration and exclusion, sunlight and shadow that grew longer with each passing day. At first, the city fascinated him. He wandered through the remnants of the Forum, touching broken columns as though they might reveal how stone could outlast kingdoms. He sketched vaults, arches, aqueducts, structures shaped by ancient hands, guided by mathematical intuition rather than modern understanding. Rome's architectural ghosts stirred something deep within him. He sensed that these ruins were not merely relics, but expressions of an engineering philosophy that sought harmony between form and purpose. He admired how the ancients had mastered weight distribution, airflow, acoustics, and durability long before the Renaissance revived these ideas. In their silent endurance, Leonardo saw a kind of dialogue across centuries, an unspoken invitation to reflect upon what civilizations build and what they leave behind. But Rome was not only a museum of stone, it was a battleground of power. The papal court, with its wealth and influence, promised commissions and patronage, yet Leonardo found himself increasingly sidelined by younger artists, whose brushstrokes dazzled audiences hungry for novelty. Raphael, graceful and charming, moved effortlessly through circles that remained closed to Leonardo. Michelangelo, fierce and tempestuous, dominated the city with a presence that felt like a storm perpetually on the horizon. Leonardo, now older, more introspective, less willing to compete on terms he found shallow, felt Rome's artistic world slipping past him like a river that no longer recognized his touch. There were commissions, but they were small. Tasks beneath his ability, offered more from courtesy than genuine desire. The Medici, who once admired him, now saw him as a figure of the past, brilliant but slow, visionary but impractical. And so Leonardo retreated into quieter pursuits, finding refuge not in painting, but in study. His notebooks from Rome reveal a mind that refused to dim simply because the world's attention had shifted. He dissected animals and human corpses when he could obtain them, though the papal authorities frowned upon such work. He studied optics with renewed intensity, filling pages with diagrams of lenses, reflections, and refractions. He immersed himself in the geometry of plants, the spiraling patterns of seashells, the branching logic of trees. In the gardens of the Vatican, he observed birds gliding over manicured hedges, their shadows sweeping across the grass like silent signatures of natural law. Yet even these quiet studies carried a subtle melancholy. Leonardo sensed that Rome did not value the kind of slow, patient inquiry he embodied. The city wanted spectacle, grandeur, drama, immediate brilliance. His methods, rooted in observation and reflection, felt increasingly at odds with the pace of the world around him. He wrote of frustration, of ideas constrained by lack of support, of experiments abandoned because materials or permissions were denied. He complained, gently but unmistakably, that envy and ignorance blocked his path more effectively than any failure of his own imagination. And still, he found pockets of solace. In the evenings, Leonardo often walked through the Vatican corridors, where candlelight shivered softly along marble walls. He found comfort in the quiet rhythm of monks chanting in distant chapels, in the deep hum of Rome's nights, in the way the sky above the city glowed faintly even after the sun had vanished. He watched stars emerge one by one, thinking of how their positions could be measured, charted, understood. He wrote about how light traveled through air, how shadows stretched differently across uneven surfaces, how moisture in the atmosphere softened color and altered the perception of distance. Even in disappointment, his curiosity refused to sleep. But there was also loneliness. Leonardo's notebooks from Rome contain reflections on aging, on how the mind grows sharper even as the body grows slower, on how ambition transforms into contemplation, on how a lifetime of ideas cannot fully fit into the years allotted. He wrote about time as though it were a river he had studied all his life, but only now realized he could not redirect. His letters hint at longing, for recognition perhaps, or simply for a place where his curiosity would be understood without suspicion or impatience. Rumors circulated about him during this period. Some believed he practiced forbidden sciences. Others whispered that his machines were dangerous, that his dissections were unholy, that his ideas were too strange to be natural. In a city ruled by the church, such rumors were not harmless. They isolated him further, making it clear that certain truths, however fascinating, were better left unspoken. And yet, the isolation had a paradoxical effect. It deepened his insight. Leonardo turned inward, focusing on the patterns that had always guided him: flow, motion, balance, transformation. His studies in Rome became some of the most abstract and philosophical of his life. He drew turbulent water in spirals and whirls that mirrored the movement of galaxies. He sketched plants not as decorative motifs, but as mathematical structures, each leaf's placement an expression of natural law. He analyzed light until the world seemed composed entirely of rays, shadows, and reflections. In these quiet explorations, he was free from patrons, free from court politics, free from the burden of proving himself. But freedom came with its own cost. Leonardo knew his time in Rome was coming to an end. He sensed that the city would not offer him the legacy he had hoped for, nor the support he needed to complete the works he imagined. And so, when the opportunity arose to leave for France, invited by a king who admired him not for speed or spectacle, but for the depth of his mind, Leonardo accepted with a calm sense of inevitability. Rome had given him much: ruins that whispered of ancient wisdom, skies that revealed the architecture of light, landscapes that shaped his understanding of nature's memory. It had challenged him, disappointed him, isolated him, yet also refined his thinking in ways no other place could. As he prepared to depart, Leonardo walked once more through the city's quiet dawn streets, tracing the shadows of arches, feeling the cool breath of the Tiber drifting over its stone embankments, listening to the echoes of a world that had once ruled half the known earth. He left Rome with no bitterness, only a gentle melancholy, a recognition that the city, with all its brilliance and blindness, had been a necessary chapter in his understanding of both nature and humanity, a chapter shaped not by triumph, but by contemplation, not by glory, but by depth. When Leonardo accepted King Francis III's invitation and crossed the mountains into France, he did so with a quiet mixture of relief and resignation, carrying with him not only trunks filled with notebooks and unfinished paintings, but also the soft exhaustion of a man who had spent his life chasing mysteries faster than time allowed him to solve them. France did not greet him with the sharp ambitions of Milan, or the competitive brilliance of Florence, or the uneasy tensions of Rome. Instead, it welcomed him like a gentle hand resting on a tired shoulder. The air felt broader, softer, freer. The Loire Valley stretched before him in rolling greens and misty blues, its rivers winding with unhurried grace, its forests thick with birdsong, its castles rising not as fortresses of power, but as echoes of a noble imagination. For the first time in many years, Leonardo felt that he had arrived in a place where curiosity was not a threat, where slowness was not a flaw, and where the weight of expectation loosened just enough to let the mind breathe. Francis VII, young, enthusiastic, and almost reverently fascinated by genius, treated Leonardo not as a servant of the court, but as a cherished advisor, a living treasure. The king visited him often, speaking with the easy warmth of someone unburdened by fear of appearing foolish. He asked Leonardo about painting, about machines, about nature, about philosophy, about anything that wandered across his mind. Leonardo, unused to such genuine admiration from someone with power, found these conversations soothing. They did not demand speed or brilliance. They simply invited presence. If Italy had shaped Leonardo through challenge and conflict, France began shaping him through calm. He was given a residence at the manor of Clos-Lucé, connected to the royal Château d'Amboise through an underground passage. The rooms were bright, the gardens peaceful, the surrounding countryside wide and open like a landscape waiting to be studied. Leonardo arranged his belongings carefully, his beloved notebooks stacked on a long table, his unfinished paintings propped gently against wooden walls, his mechanical models placed where he could see them while he worked. The Mona Lisa, which had travelled with him like a quiet companion for years, hung near his bed. The St. John the Baptist leaned near a window where the light softened its shadows. These works, reflections of decades of thought and patience, formed a kind of private gallery only he and perhaps the king ever truly understood. Yet even in this sanctuary, Leonardo could feel the slow tightening of age. His right hand, once steady enough to draw lines finer than a strand of hair, had begun to tremble unpredictably. Some days he could work with clarity and precision. Other days the muscles refused to obey him. He still painted, but less, and with greater hesitation. No longer able to execute his visions with the mastery he demanded of himself, he turned more fully to planning, observing, teaching. His mind remained sharp, wide, full of brilliance, but his body no longer matched its pace. Instead of resisting this shift, Leonardo accepted it with the same calm he applied to studying the patterns of nature. Seasons changed, rivers rose and fell, bodies aged. To fight these truths was to misunderstand life's design. So he poured his energy into reflection. He spent long hours writing, notes on anatomy he no longer had the strength to pursue in the dissecting room, sketches of machines he knew he would never build, observations of plants unfolding in the morning sun, diagrams of river currents, lists of principles he wished he had time to shape into books. His notebooks from this period contained some of his most philosophical musings, thoughts softened by the nearness of mortality, yet sharpened by the clarity that comes when ambition relaxes its grip. He wrote about the nature of the soul, about the responsibilities of a painter, about the relationship between necessity and invention, about the ethics of curiosity. He reflected on time as though negotiating with it, acknowledging that his mind still held more ideas than his remaining years could carry. Despite his growing frailty, Francis IV valued him profoundly. The king often sat beside him, listening to Leonardo speak about geometry, about the behavior of water, about the flight of birds. These moments were not performances. They were gentle exchanges between a man nearing the end of his earthly explorations and a monarch who recognized the privilege of learning from him. Francis called Leonardo "my father," not out of obligation, but affection. And Leonardo, who had always kept a cautious distance from patrons, allowed himself to accept this warmth, understanding perhaps that rare moments of kindness need not be resisted. The gardens around Clos Lucé became his quiet refuge. He walked among the trees when he could, leaning slightly on a cane, stopping to watch how leaves curled in the wind, how shadows changed shape as clouds drifted overhead. Even as his body weakened, his curiosity did not fade. It simply softened, turning outward rather than upward, finding beauty in small details rather than grand ambitions. He watched insects with the same attentiveness he once gave to anatomical structures. He studied stones with the patience of a geologist. He traced the movement of water across shallow earth as though it were a miniature version of the rivers he once dreamed of redirecting. In these observations, he found peace. But there were also moments of quiet sorrow. Leonardo knew he would never return to Italy. He knew the great projects he once imagined, treatises, inventions, grand engineering designs, would remain unfinished. He felt regret not for what he had failed to complete, but for the impossibility of fitting an entire universe of curiosity into a single lifetime. And yet, he did not dwell on disappointment. Instead, he wrote with gentle acceptance about the nature of incompleteness, about how human endeavor is always an approximation of understanding, about how every insight opens the door to another question. To seek completeness, he believed, was to misunderstand the nature of inquiry. In these final years, Leonardo often revisited the paintings he had carried with him. He studied the Mona Lisa, running his aging fingers lightly along the frame, reflecting on how her smile had traveled with him through triumphs and disappointments, through cities and kingdoms, through youth and age. He looked at St. John the Baptist, its mysterious expression echoing something of his own lifelong search for meaning. He studied his anatomical drawings, marveling at the precision he had once achieved. These works became mirrors, not of vanity, but of the persistence of a mind that refused to yield to time's narrowing horizon. As spring returned to the Loire Valley each year, Leonardo found comfort in watching the world renew itself. Blossoms emerged from bare branches, riverbanks swelled with thawed water, birds returned to build nests beneath eaves and in tall trees. He had spent his entire life studying nature, yet in these final years, nature gave something back, a lesson in continuity, in cycles, in the quiet truth that life does not end so much as change form. France, for Leonardo, became not a place of exile, but a refuge where he could let his ideas settle like leaves drifting to the ground, knowing that even if he could not arrange them into perfect order, they still carried their own quiet meaning. And as he wrote, as he instructed his pupils, as he walked through gardens filled with sunlight and shadow, he felt something soften within him, a gentle release, the easing of a lifetime spent reaching for knowledge that always seemed just a little further than his grasp. In the final stretch of Leonardo's life, time began to move differently. It no longer rushed past him as it had in his youth, when every hour seemed too short for the vast territories of curiosity he wished to explore. Nor did it weigh heavily upon him as it had during the more turbulent years in Milan and Rome, when patrons demanded results, when politics intruded upon study, when the world pressed impatiently against the quiet discipline of observation. In France, time drifted like a slow river, widening as it approached the sea, carrying him gently rather than pushing or pulling. And Leonardo, who had always tried to outrun the boundaries of his era, now allowed himself to drift with this current, sensing that he had reached the place where striving softened into contemplation, where ambition dissolved into gratitude for the mysteries he had been privileged to witness. Each morning at Clos Lucé unfolded with a stillness that felt almost holy. Sunlight entered the windows at a shallow angle, illuminating dust motes that spun like tiny galaxies in the quiet air. Leonardo would sit at his writing table with a blanket over his shoulders, the stiffness in his right hand reminding him that his body had begun to negotiate its last terms with the world. He could no longer draw with the precision that had once defined him, but the gesture of writing, slow, careful, deliberate, remained within his reach. And so he filled page after page with thoughts, diagrams, reflections, instructions, fragments of 1,000 unfinished books. These notes were not frantic attempts to preserve everything before death approached. They were gentle offerings to the future, seeds carried on a breeze. He knew he would never feel fully bloom. He wrote about water, about the geometry of currents, about the mathematics of erosion. He wrote about birds, recalling their spirals and sudden shifts in the wind. He wrote about anatomy, describing the way the heart's valves directed the flow of blood, the way muscles layered themselves like woven fabric under the skin. He wrote about painting, about how light enters the eye, about how perspective tricks the mind into believing that depth exists on a flat surface. And beneath all of these subjects, he wrote about the nature of inquiry itself, how curiosity is both a gift and a burden, how understanding grows not through certainty, but through humility, how every discovery reveals another layer of mystery. These late writings, though fragmentary, carried a softness that had not been present in his younger years. They were the reflections of a man who had spent his life seeking truth, and who now understood that truth was not a destination, but a companionship. But Leonardo did not spend his days only at his desk. When weather allowed, he walked slowly through the gardens of Clos Lucé, leaning on a staff, his steps measured but purposeful. The gardens were not grand, yet they offered endless fascination. He paused to observe how vines curled around wooden posts, how the bark of trees cracked in delicate patterns, how insects navigated the contours of leaves with instinctive precision. These small wonders soothed him in a way that the grand projects of his youth never had. They required no invention, no patronage, no audience. They simply existed, asking only to be seen. And Leonardo saw them with the same depth he once gave to the flight of birds or the shape of rivers. Age had narrowed his physical world, but not his wonder. Often he spent afternoons speaking with his pupils, Francesco Melzi most of all, the young man who would become the keeper of his manuscripts after his death. Leonardo spoke slowly now, choosing his words with care. He explained principles of mechanics, described experiments he wished he had time to finish, recounted failures not with regret, but with affection, as though each abandoned project had been a companion. He told Melzi to value observation above speculation, to question inherited knowledge, to approach nature not as a puzzle to be conquered, but as a teacher to be listened to. Melzi absorbed these lessons with reverence, aware that he was receiving the distilled essence of a lifetime spent in pursuit of understanding. Visitors occasionally arrived from the French court, bringing news or simply seeking to sit in the presence of the famed master. Leonardo welcomed them politely, though he no longer felt the need to impress or perform. He answered questions gently, sometimes with humor, sometimes with stories that wandered like country paths, but always led to insight. The French nobles admired him, not only for his achievements, but for the serenity that now surrounded him. A serenity born not from resignation, but from acceptance, a recognition that he had traveled as far as one mind could reasonably travel within the limits of a single life. Among the possessions he kept closest in these days were 3 paintings: the Mona Lisa, the St. John the Baptist, and the Virgin and Child with St. Anne. These works, which had accompanied him through multiple cities and decades, had become more than artistic accomplishments. They were repositories of memory. The Mona Lisa, with her unfathomable smile, seemed to mirror back to him the openness and ambiguity he had come to value in all things. St. John, with his enigmatic gesture and gentle shadows, reflected the mystery of spiritual longing. And St. Anne, serene and layered with complexity, reminded him of the tenderness and interconnectedness of human relationships. Leonardo spent long hours contemplating these canvases, not to critique or adjust them, but simply to dwell in their presence. Occasionally he allowed himself to think about Italy, the hills of Vinci, the workshops of Florence, the canals of Milan, the ruins of Rome. He remembered the rush of discovery, the frustration of unfinished work, the exhilaration of invention, the quiet triumphs and quieter disappointments. But he did not dwell on these memories with bitterness or longing. Instead, he viewed his past with the same tenderness he gave to his paintings, understanding that each chapter had contributed something essential to the tapestry of his life. As the seasons turned and the evenings grew colder, Leonardo felt his strength diminish little by little. The tremor in his hand grew more pronounced, the fatigue settled more quickly over his limbs, and there were days when writing a single paragraph cost him more effort than sculpting an entire model once had. But even as the body slowed, the mind remained luminous. He continued to dictate notes when writing became too difficult, continued to imagine machines he knew would never be built, continued to marvel at how light poured through the windows of his quiet room. His last months were not filled with fear, but with reflection, with gratitude for the vastness of the world and the privilege of having observed even a fraction of its complexity. And so, Leonardo's final days were shaped not by decline, but by a deepening, a softening of ambition into wisdom, a turning inward that revealed the quiet beauty of a life spent searching. He did not see his unfinished works as failures, but as invitations for others to continue the journey, as reminders that understanding is always a collaboration across generations. He had lived fully in the space between knowledge and wonder, and even as his own chapter approached its close, he remained profoundly in love with the mystery of existence. In these final days, surrounded by pages that rustled softly in the breeze and paintings that glowed in the filtered French light, Leonardo da Vinci faced the end of life with the same curiosity that had guided his beginning, letting each moment unfold with the gentle dignity of someone who has learned that the greatest truths are often the ones too vast to be spoken. Legacy is often imagined as something loud, a triumphant final act, a grand achievement, a moment when the world pauses to recognize a life's work. But for Leonardo da Vinci, legacy was something different, something quieter and more enduring, something that did not announce itself with fanfare, but settled slowly into the fabric of human understanding, like dawn light spreading over a sleeping landscape. When he died in the gentle refuge of France, there was no single masterpiece unveiling, no monumental structure bearing his name, no final invention that reshaped the world overnight. Instead, what remained were pages filled with diagrams and questions, paintings he carried with him until the end, fragments of ideas that looked incomplete to the untrained eye, but contained within them entire futures waiting to be unfolded. His legacy did not erupt. It seeped, flowing through centuries with the same patient persistence he once admired in rivers carving their way through stone. In the years immediately following his death, much of Leonardo's work seemed to vanish into private collections, personal archives, and dusty rooms where notebooks were stacked without context. The world, still caught in the rhythms of war and shifting powers, did not yet understand the magnitude of what he had left behind. It would take generations for scholars to decipher his mirror-written notes, for anatomists to marvel at the accuracy of his drawings, for engineers to recognize the seeds of modern machinery hidden in sketches that appeared whimsical to Renaissance eyes. His contemporaries remembered him primarily as a painter, the creator of a few enigmatic works that seemed to whisper rather than declare. Yet even they sensed that something about Leonardo refused to stay confined within a single lifetime. His influence spread in subtle ways. Artists began to study his use of light, his softness of edges, his commitment to observation over tradition. Anatomists found in his drawings a precision that surpassed textbooks, as though Leonardo had drawn not bodies, but truths themselves. Engineers encountered his diagrams of gears, lifts, and flying machines, and sensed with awe that they were standing at the edge of ideas too far ahead of their time to be constructed with the materials then available. Even in their incompleteness, his notebooks radiated potential. They were not instructions. They were invitations, opening doors into fields that had not yet been named. Centuries passed, and the world changed in ways Leonardo could never have predicted, though he had often glimpsed possibilities long before they existed. Machines capable of flight filled the skies he once studied with reverence. Rivers were redirected, canals engineered with precision that echoed his insights. Medicine advanced along pathways he had traced with careful strokes, revealing the structures he had been the first to draw with scientific accuracy. Artists sought the elusive softness of his shadows, the quiet depth of his expressions, the unmistakable presence that lived in the faces he painted. Every discipline he touched found itself enriched by his curiosity, as though Leonardo had sprinkled seeds across time, trusting future generations to cultivate them. And yet, even these tangible influences fail to fully describe his legacy. For perhaps the most enduring part of what Leonardo left behind is not any single invention, technique, or theory, but a way of looking at the world, a way of asking questions, of seeing connections, of believing that knowledge is not a possession, but a journey. He showed that disciplines are not boundaries, but bridges, that art and science are not opposites, but companions, that curiosity is not a fleeting emotion, but a lifelong practice that deepens the soul. His notebooks reveal a mind that refused confinement, a mind that treated everything, clouds, machines, muscles, fossils, laughter, light, as part of the same intricate tapestry. This spirit, more than any individual achievement, became the essence of his legacy. It inspired scientists like Newton and Galileo who saw in Leonardo a predecessor who had dared to question the nature of motion and light long before physics had the language to describe them. It guided artists from Raphael to Rembrandt, to the modern masters who studied the subtleties of his sfumato, seeking the delicate transitions that made his figures seem alive. It influenced engineers, architects, philosophers, a ripple spreading outward indefinitely, touching minds who had never heard his name directly, but who felt his presence in the foundations of their fields. But legacy is not only about influence, it is also about memory. And in this sense, Leonardo occupies a rare space in human history. His name is spoken with affection as often as with awe. He is remembered not as a distant monument of genius, but as a man who held wonder in his hands with tenderness. A man who stood beneath the sky and asked how birds soared. A man who touched a river's surface and asked how it moved. A man who looked into a human face and asked what thoughts flickered behind the eyes. A man who understood that to observe deeply is an act of love. In the quiet rooms of museums, people gather before the Mona Lisa, drawn not merely by fame, but by the soft mystery of her expression, a mystery that reflects the same curiosity Leonardo carried throughout his life. In laboratories, researchers examine his anatomical sketches and feel the humbling realization that centuries earlier, a single mind saw further than the tools of his time allowed. In engineering classrooms, students study his early concept sketches, sensing the spark that leaps across ages. In philosophy discussions, his reflections on nature, motion, and perception linger like gentle echoes of a mind that sought unity where others saw division. And in the collective imagination of humanity, Leonardo da Vinci remains something rare. Not only an extraordinary thinker, but a symbol of what it means to be fully alive, to observe, to question, to create, to remain endlessly curious. His legacy whispers through books, through paintings, through inventions, through dreams. It moves not with the force of a storm, but with the persistence of a tide, touching shore after shore as centuries continue to unfold. Leonardo's life did not resolve into a single triumph, nor did it settle neatly into the categories history prefers. Instead, it stretched outward in countless directions, each unfinished project pointing toward futures he would not see, each idea scattering like seeds across the landscapes of human thought. His legacy remains not a monument, but a movement, a quiet, continuous unfolding that invites every generation to look more closely, to question more gently, and to imagine more boldly than they did before. And in this way, long after his footsteps faded from the gardens of France, Leonardo da Vinci continues to walk with us, guiding the gaze of anyone who chooses to wonder.